By the early Holocene, the river plains of Mesopotamia formed one of the most fertile environmental zones in Southwest Asia. When the last glacial period receded and the Younger Dryas cold phase ended around 9600 BCE, Southwest Asia entered a new climatic regime defined by increasing temperatures and gradually rising precipitation. In the area later known as Mesopotamia, literally the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates carved broad alluvial plains that stretched from the foothills of the Zagros Mountains toward the Persian Gulf. This landscape was not yet the urban heartland of later civilizations, but an evolving ecological zone whose physical properties made it unusually suited to sustained human occupation. Seasonal flooding transported fine mineral sediments from the upper catchments and deposited them across low-lying plains, creating fertile soils with high nutrient potential. These conditions, paired with shifting rainfall patterns, supported a rich mosaic of wild cereals, grazing animals, and wetland resources that encouraged longer-term settlement. During the early Holocene, rainfall was distributed more generously across northern Mesopotamia than the southern marshlands. Paleoclimatic data derived from lake cores and speleothems suggests that between roughly 10,000 and 7,000 BCE, northern regions benefited from higher moisture availability, supporting steppe grasslands and open woodlands. The Tigris and Euphrates acted as stabilizing water sources in this setting, concentrating vegetation along their banks. This environmental predictability reduced the risks associated with prolonged occupation, offering reliable access to freshwater, reed beds, and wild plant stands. It is in this northern arc, sometimes called the hilly flanks, that some of the earliest sedentary communities in Mesopotamia emerged. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Zawi Kemi Shanidar, located near the Zagros foothills, illustrates this transition. Dated to around 10,000 BCE, Zawi Kemi shows traces of semi-permanent structures, ground stone tools for processing cereals, and evidence of communal activity. Although the inhabitants were still primarily foragers, their material culture indicates repeated, possibly seasonal return to a single locality. The proximity of wild sheep, goats, and cattle herds, along with stands of wild barley and einkorn, offered incentives to remain. The environment did not force sedentism, but it reduced the necessity of large-scale mobility. Further south, at Mlefit, excavated evidence reveals circular huts, storage pits, and chipped stone tools associated with intensive plant exploitation. The presence of pre-domestication cultivation, the harvesting and replanting of wild cereals, suggests that human groups were beginning to experiment with deliberate landscape management. These behaviors were directly shaped by the ecological conditions of the Tigris-Euphrates corridor. Regular water flow, predictable flood cycles, and nutrient-rich sediments created a feedback loop in which humans could anticipate resource availability and plan food collection strategies over longer periods. Flora played a central role in this shift. The region supported naturally occurring stands of emmer wheat, einkorn, and barley, species that responded favorably to human harvesting. Repeated collection near settlement hubs unintentionally encouraged the growth of non-shattering varieties, the first genetic markers of domestication. Grinding stones and sickle blades found at early sites bear microwear patterns consistent with cereal processing, reinforcing the view that plant exploitation was becoming routine rather than opportunistic. The ecological abundance of these grains provided reliable caloric returns, reducing the risk of sedentary life. Faunal resources complemented this plant base. Herds of gazelle, wild cattle, aurochs, and caprines frequented riverine zones, drawn by water and grazing pastures. Archaeozoological assemblages show selective hunting strategies, with communities targeting animals of specific age groups. Over time, close proximity to wild goats and sheep created the conditions for early herd management. While true domestication occurred later, the ecological intimacy between humans and herd animals began in this era of semi-settlement, facilitated by the stable niches created by the river plains. Climatic variability remained a factor. The early Holocene was punctuated by microshifts in rainfall and temperature, but the overall trend favored increased humidity in northern Mesopotamia. As water tables rose, wetlands expanded along the Euphrates, creating rich marsh environments filled with fish, waterfowl, and reeds. These wetlands were ecological anchors, supporting diversified subsistence strategies. The combination of agricultural experimentation, hunting, fishing, and gathering created a resilient food web that could sustain larger populations for longer durations. Though irrigation systems are typically associated with later phases, precursory water management practices may have begun during the late pre-pottery periods. Simple channels diverting seasonal runoff or river overflows into low-lying fields appear in the archaeological record of Ubaid precursors, hinting at early human attempts to harness water predictably. These rudimentary systems were not yet the engineered canals of later city-states, but they demonstrate an emerging awareness that controlling water could amplify agricultural yields. By 700 BCE, prolonged settlement was increasingly feasible. Mud-brick architecture appears in multiple early sites, indicating a level of permanence that stone and thatch shelters did not require. Storage features, including silos and pits, reflect surplus production, which in turn suggests greater confidence in environmental stability. The ecological generosity of the Tigris-Euphrates system was not merely a backdrop, it was a force shaping human behavior. Predictable flood cycles replenish soils year after year, reducing the need for constant relocation and fostering the structural preconditions for agriculture. Analytically, three patterns emerge from this early ecological phase. First, environmental opportunity, not technological innovation, was the primary catalyst for sedentism. Second, the distribution of resources along the river corridor created settlement hierarchies, with northern zones becoming population centers earlier than the arid south. Third, the interplay between water, soil, and wild species produced long-term feedback mechanisms that encouraged experimentation in cultivation and animal management. As food production stabilized, permanent village communities began to emerge. By the 6th millennium BCE, irrigation-supported agriculture was reshaping settlement patterns across northern and southern Mesopotamia. Between approximately 6,500 and 4,500 BCE, the Mesopotamian lowlands and adjacent uplands underwent a significant transition from loosely clustered sedentary hamlets to more structured Neolithic village societies. This transformation was driven primarily by the consolidation of agriculture, the emergence of reliable food surpluses, and the development of new technologies, most notably pottery and systematic irrigation. Archaeological data show that these changes were neither uniform nor instantaneous. Instead, they unfolded across distinct cultural zones whose interactions laid the foundation for later regional integration. One of the earliest village traditions identified in northern Mesopotamia is associated with the Hassuna culture, centered on sites such as Tel Hassuna near the Upper Tigris. Excavations reveal rectilinear mud-brick houses arranged in compact clusters, indicating a stable settlement layout rather than temporary occupation. The presence of grinding stones, storage bins, and domesticated cereal remains points to fully established agriculture. Emmer wheat and barley were cultivated, while sheep, goats, and cattle had become routine components of subsistence. The architecture reflects household-level production, with individual family units responsible for processing and storing their own food. However, shared courtyards and communal ovens suggest coordinated activity within the village, signaling a nascent form of collective organization. The introduction and widespread use of pottery marks a key technological development during this period. Hassuna ware, characterized by simple geometric painted designs, represents one of the earliest ceramic traditions in northern Mesopotamia. Pottery allowed for improved food storage, boiling, and transport, contributing to dietary diversification and reducing losses from spoilage. Its standardized manufacture also implies specialized knowledge, foreshadowing the emergence of craft differentiation. The ability to store surplus grain for longer intervals bolstered demographic stability, enabling population growth and longer settlement occupation. Further south along the Tigris, sites such as Tel Es-Sawan illustrate more complex village systems emerging by the late 6th millennium BCE. Tel Es-Sawan is notable for its evidence of large communal storage buildings, sometimes interpreted as granaries. These structures, constructed with carefully laid mud brick and plastered floors, suggest that surplus production was being pooled at a community level rather than retained solely within households. This shift indicates increasing cooperation in food management, possibly tied to collective labor in irrigation maintenance or crop harvesting. The discovery of clay figurines, including stylized female forms, points to symbolic or ritual behavior, though their precise meanings remain debated. Rather than indicating a centralized cult, most scholars interpret them as household or communal artifacts reflecting shared cultural practices. The Samara culture, associated with sites such as Samara and Chogamami, provides some of the earliest clear evidence for deliberate irrigation systems. At Chogamami, archaeologists identified linear canals diverting water from nearby waterways onto cultivated fields. This marks a significant departure from rainfall-dependent agriculture, allowing communities to expand cultivation into drier zones and better control planting cycles. Irrigation increased yields and reduced vulnerability to seasonal fluctuations, supporting larger populations and more permanent village structures. The painted ceramics associated with Samara, characterized by intricate geometric and animal motifs, indicate not only stylistic innovation but also broader social interaction patterns, as similar wares appear across multiple settlements. Trade networks also became more visible during this phase. The presence of obsidian, sourced primarily from Anatolian volcanoes, in villages across northern Mesopotamia, reflects long-distance exchange. While the scale of trade was limited, it demonstrates that Neolithic communities participated in broader regional interactions, exchanging raw materials and possibly finished goods. These networks likely facilitated the spread of technologies, including pottery styles and agricultural techniques. The movement of materials and ideas between highland and lowland zones contributed to increasing cultural cohesion across the region. Social organization in these Neolithic villages appears to have been largely household-based, with decision-making likely embedded in kin groups rather than centralized authority. Domestic structures were relatively uniform in size, suggesting limited social stratification. However, the presence of communal storage and coordinated irrigation implies some form of leadership or collective management. Leadership during this period was probably situational and role-based, linked to agricultural planning, construction projects, or ritual activities, rather than institutional or hereditary. Evidence does not support formal hierarchies, but it does indicate a shift toward cooperative governance. Agricultural surpluses gradually enabled specialization. While most inhabitants continued to farm and herd animals, some individuals devoted more time to tasks such as pottery production, toolmaking, or construction. This diversification increased economic efficiency and facilitated technological refinement. The appearance of increasingly standardized ceramics and carefully planned village layouts marks a step toward more structured labor systems. Environmental factors continued to shape development. In the north, higher rainfall allowed dry farming to persist, whereas southern Mesopotamia, characterized by lower precipitation and expanding alluvial plains, became increasingly dependent on irrigation. As populations grew, settlements expanded southward, setting the stage for later cultural developments in the alluvial lowlands. The demographic momentum generated by reliable food production contributed directly to the emergence of larger, more complex communities in the subsequent Ubaid period. By the end of the 5th millennium BCE, Mesopotamia was no longer a landscape of isolated hamlets. Instead, it contained interconnected village societies with shared technological practices, expanding agricultural systems, and emerging communal institutions. The economic base created by irrigation-supported cultivation and surplus storage allowed population densities to rise beyond what mobile or forage-based systems could sustain. These structural shifts established the demographic and organizational foundations necessary for proto-urban development. Increasing complexity in village organization paved the way for broader regional cultural integration. By the late Ubaid era, a recognizable hierarchy of settlements had taken shape along the southern alluvium. Between approximately 5,300 and 4,100 BCE, the Ubaid period marked a major transition in Mesopotamian social and cultural development, defined by increasing settlement size, architectural standardization, and broader regional integration. Archaeologists identify the Ubaid as the first horizon to extend across both northern and southern Mesopotamia with a relatively uniform material culture. This consistency, most visible in its pottery and architecture, reflects expanding interaction networks and the emergence of structured social organization. Southern Mesopotamia, particularly the alluvial lowlands near the head of the Persian Gulf, became the core zone of Ubaid development, providing the geographic platform for later urbanization. One of the clearest indicators of Ubaid cultural cohesion is its distinctive pottery tradition. Ubaid ceramics, typically wheel-finished, pale greenish clay vessels with dark geometric painted bands, appear at numerous sites across the southern plain and into northern regions such as Tepe Gora. Their widespread distribution suggests shared production standards and long-distance exchange. The shift toward more standardized, mass-produced forms indicates increased specialization among craftspeople and suggests that pottery may have been produced in centralized workshops rather than exclusively within households. This development reflects growing economic coordination and marks a departure from the more localized ceramic traditions of the preceding Neolithic cultures. Architecture provides further evidence of increasing social organization. Across major Ubaid sites, tripartite building plans, rectangular structures divided into a central hall with flanking rooms, became a common feature. This standardized layout is interpreted as a functional response to communal activities, storage, and administrative needs. More significantly, several sites exhibit platformed buildings that represent the earliest stages of monumental architecture in southern Mesopotamia. At Eridu, often regarded as one of the earliest significant settlements of the Ubaid horizon, excavators uncovered a sequence of temples constructed atop progressively enlarged platforms. These structures indicate organized labor and suggest that certain individuals or groups supervised construction and ritual activity. Although these early temples were modest compared to later ziggurats, they represent a crucial step toward institutionalized religious authority. The growth of settlements further illustrates increasing complexity. Surveys conducted across the southern alluvium show a tiered settlement hierarchy, with a small number of large villages surrounded by smaller satellite hamlets. Eridu and Ur are often identified as primary centers during the later Ubaid phases. Their size and architectural investment imply administrative functions beyond simple habitation. This stratification suggests that decision-making was becoming concentrated in certain locations, reflecting early forms of centralized leadership. Population clustering around these key sites marks a departure from the more dispersed settlement patterns of earlier centuries. Economic evidence reinforces this pattern of consolidation. The Ubaid period saw the expansion of long-distance exchange networks, transporting materials such as copper from Oman and bitumen from northern Mesopotamia or the Iranian plateau. Bitumen, valued for waterproofing boats and construction, indicates active waterborne transport in the marshlands of the southern delta. The movement of prestige goods and raw materials implies coordinated trade and possibly elite oversight. Although the scale of exchange was limited compared to later periods, these networks demonstrate increasing regional interdependence. Irrigation systems also expanded significantly during the Ubaid horizon. Archaeologists have identified traces of canal networks extending across southern Mesopotamia, indicating controlled water distribution for agriculture. Unlike earlier small-scale canals, Ubaid irrigation appears to have required collective labor and long-term planning. Managing water flow, maintaining channels, and organizing planting schedules would have necessitated leadership roles and cooperative governance. This infrastructural development strengthened agricultural productivity, supported higher population densities, and reinforced the authority of individuals or groups capable of organizing labor. Social hierarchy during the Ubaid period remains a topic of scholarly debate, as direct evidence of formal classes or rulers is limited. However, several indicators suggest the emergence of proto-elite groups. Differences in building size, the presence of specialized structures, and the concentration of ritual architecture in major settlements imply unequal access to resources and decision-making power. Burials from Ubaid sites generally lack rich grave goods, suggesting that inequality was not yet expressed through funerary practices. Instead, Status may have been tied to administrative functions, religious roles, or control of irrigation and trade networks. Leadership was likely institutional rather than purely kin-based, representing a shift toward more formalized authority. The spread of Ubaid cultural traits beyond southern Mesopotamia is another key development. Standardized pottery and architectural styles appear in northern regions, including areas traditionally associated with different cultural traditions. This diffusion may reflect migration, trade, or cultural influence emanating from the southern centers. Whatever the mechanism, the Ubaid horizon demonstrates a level of regional connectivity unprecedented in earlier periods. This integration laid the foundation for later political and economic unification during the Uruk period. Analytically, the Ubaid era represents a critical stage in the evolution of Mesopotamian society. The combination of agricultural surplus, architectural standardization, irrigation-based labor coordination, and settlement hierarchy indicates a shift from village-level autonomy to broader regional systems. The emergence of temple architecture suggests that religious institutions played a central role in organizing labor and legitimizing authority. These developments created the institutional and ideological structures necessary for the rise of complex urban centers. By the end of the Ubaid period, southern Mesopotamia had developed the population density, economic networks, and administrative frameworks that would support true urbanization. Settlement hierarchies were firmly established, and key sites functioned as regional hubs. Although cities in the full sense had not yet emerged, the structural conditions for urban development were firmly in place. These developments led directly to the rise of true urban centers. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk represented the largest known urban center on Earth. Between approximately 4100 and 3100 BCE, the settlement of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia underwent a sustained expansion that transformed it from a regional hub into the earliest demonstrable urban center in world history. Archaeological surveys and stratigraphic excavations indicate that by its peak in the late Uruk phase, the site covered roughly 250 hectares, far surpassing the scale of contemporary settlements across Southwest Asia. This growth was not simply a matter of increasing population density. It reflected deliberate spatial organization, monumental construction, and administrative innovation. The Uruk period marks the point at which settlement hierarchies, labor organization, and public infrastructure reached a level that can be defined as urban in both scale and function. The physical layout of Uruk provides the clearest evidence for early urban planning. Researchers have identified distinct architectural zones, including large temple precincts, residential quarters, and specialized craft areas. Two monumental districts dominate the site. The Yana precinct, characterized by a succession of temple complexes, and the Anu precinct, anchored by a massive platform that later supported the White Temple. These precincts were constructed on raised terraces, indicating long-term planning and significant labor mobilization. The repeated rebuilding of temples on increasingly larger foundations suggests continuity of institutional authority across generations. The scale and organization of these precincts imply that religious institutions played a central role in managing resources and directing construction activity. The Yana district, in particular, demonstrates advanced architectural planning. Excavations reveal structures built with cone mosaic veneers, gypsum-plastered walls, and monumental stairways. The uniformity of building techniques across multiple phases indicates standardized construction methods and coordinated labor forces. Such projects would have required logistical planning, including material procurement, workforce organization, and scheduling activities consistent with centralized oversight. The presence of open courtyards and large halls suggests that these structures served not only ritual purposes but also administrative and storage functions, reinforcing their importance in managing surplus and redistributing goods. Outside the temple precincts, the distribution of workshops and kilns indicates specialized craft production. Archaeologists have identified areas dedicated to pottery, metallurgy, and textile manufacture, pointing to an economy that extended beyond subsistence agriculture. Standardized bevel rim bowls, produced in large quantities during this period, may reflect mass distribution of rations, possibly to laborers engaged in temple construction or canal maintenance. Their uniform size and widespread presence suggest bureaucratic control over food allocation. This development marks a shift toward institutionalized labor systems and differentiated economic roles within the population. Uruk's growth was closely tied to its administrative innovations, particularly in record-keeping. During this period, the use of clay tokens, small geometric objects representing commodities such as grain or livestock, became increasingly common. These tokens were sometimes sealed within clay bulli, which served as containers and evidence of transactions. The sealing of bulli with cylinder or stamp seals provided a means of authentication, indicating formal agreements or controlled distribution. As economic activities expanded, the need for more efficient accounting grew. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the first known numerical tablets and proto-cuneiform signs emerged at Uruk, representing a major shift from physical tokens to written records. This transition reflects the increasing complexity of urban administration and the need to track production, storage, and labor on a large scale. The city's infrastructure also illustrates planned development. Surveys reveal remnants of canal networks integrated into the settlement layout, suggesting deliberate coordination between water management and urban expansion. These canals likely facilitated transport, irrigation, and sanitation. The proximity of Uruk to navigable waterways made it a central node in regional exchange, enhancing its economic reach. The integration of canals into the city plan indicates that water management was not peripheral but foundational to urban growth and daily function. Population density increased significantly during the Uruk period. While exact figures remain debated, estimates suggest several tens of thousands of inhabitants at its peak. The concentration of population required new forms of organization, including allocation of land, regulation of resources, and enforcement of communal norms. Archaeological evidence points to a multi-tiered settlement hierarchy, with smaller villages and towns surrounding Uruk and linked to it economically. This pattern indicates a regional system in which Uruk functioned as a central administrative and religious hub, overseeing production and distribution across a broader territory. The emergence of public architecture marks another defining aspect of early urbanism. The scale of construction in the Yana and Anu districts exceeds the capacity of household-level organization, implying centralized planning. These structures likely served as focal points for communal gatherings, rituals, and administrative activities, reinforcing social cohesion and institutional authority. Their visibility and permanence suggest that public architecture was used to communicate power and stability, supporting emerging hierarchies. Analytically, the rise of Uruk represents a key transformation in human social organization. The shift from village-scale autonomy to a city-centered system demonstrates how surplus production, specialized labor, and administrative oversight could support dense populations. The integration of religious institutions into economic and political functions suggests that ideological authority played a role in legitimizing centralized control. The introduction of record-keeping technologies indicates that urban complexity required new methods of managing information and resources. The scale and coordination evident in Uruk distinguish it from earlier settlements. Rather than growing organically, the city appears to have developed through deliberate planning and sustained institutional guidance. Its monumental precincts, standardized production systems, and administrative innovations illustrate a cohesive urban framework. These features collectively mark the Uruk period as the world's earliest confirmed example of large-scale urbanism, providing the structural model for later Mesopotamian city-states. Urban complexity required new administrative technologies. Early writing emerged as a direct response to expanding economic administration. Between roughly 3500 and 3200 BCE, administrative practices in southern Mesopotamia underwent a decisive transformation, driven by the increasing scale of economic activity centered in urban hubs such as Uruk. As population densities rose and institutional structures expanded, traditional methods of tracking goods and labor became insufficient. This period marks the transition from simple token-based accounting to clay tablets bearing numerical signs and pictographic symbols, representing the earliest stages of writing. The emergence of proto-writing was not a literary development but an administrative solution designed to manage surplus, labor, and resource allocation in complex urban systems. The earliest evidence for these innovations appears in the administrative levels of Uruk Level 4, where excavations recovered hundreds of clay tablets. These tablets are predominantly concerned with economic record-keeping rather than narrative or legal content. Most contain numerical notations documenting quantities of grain, livestock, or manufactured goods. The marks are arranged in systematic patterns, indicating standardized accounting procedures. Their highly repetitive nature underscores their practical purpose: recording transactions, monitoring production, and regulating redistribution. These records demonstrate that, by the late 4th millennium BCE, economic management required formal documentation. Before the appearance of tablets, administrative systems relied on clay tokens, small geometric objects representing specific commodities. Tokens of different shapes signified different goods, such as grain portions, sheep, or oil. When transactions were finalized, tokens could be sealed inside clay bulli, which were then impressed with seal motifs to authenticate agreements. This method worked for limited exchanges but became untenable as volume and complexity increased. The accumulation of materials and the need for rapid verification prompted a shift toward more efficient recording. The move from physical counters to incised marks on clay represents a significant administrative advance, allowing quantities to be recorded without storing bulky tokens. The introduction of numerical signs marks the first stage of proto-writing. These signs were not phonetic. They represented quantities directly. Different counting systems existed for different types of goods, indicating that accounting was tailored to the commodity being measured. For example, grain and livestock were recorded using distinct numerical conventions. This specialization reflects a sophisticated administrative apparatus capable of differentiating between resource categories. It also implies the presence of trained personnel familiar with these systems, suggesting an emerging class of administrative specialists. Shortly after the appearance of numerical tablets, pictographic symbols began to accompany numerical notations. These symbols depicted recognizable objects, such as jars, heads of cattle, or sheaves of grain, and served to clarify the commodity associated with the recorded quantity. Over time, these pictographs became increasingly stylized, losing their literal forms in favor of standardized signs. This development marks a crucial step toward cuneiform, as the pictographs became abstract symbols representing specific administrative categories. The shift from images to standardized signs indicates a move toward conceptual notation rather than direct representation, a hallmark of true writing systems. The physical format of the tablets provides insight into their use. Many tablets from Uruk Level 4 are small, palm-sized pieces of clay divided into ruled compartments. These compartments organize entries into separate fields, suggesting that scribes followed established recording procedures. Some tablets include impressions from cylinder seals, which served as signatures or authorization marks. The use of seals indicates that administrative records were tied to institutional authority, likely associated with temple complexes or centralized storage facilities. The presence of sealings on storage containers reinforces the connection between written records and controlled distribution. The content of these tablets reflects the administrative priorities of the time. A substantial portion documents grain accounting, including measurements of barley allocations and storage quantities. Other tablets track labor assignments, recording workers associated with specific tasks or production units. These entries imply that labor was organized on a collective basis, possibly under institutional oversight. Evidence from bevel rim bowl distributions supports the interpretation that rations were allocated through controlled systems, potentially linked to labor mobilization for construction or agricultural projects. Administrative tablets thus provide direct evidence of institutional involvement in resource management. Temple institutions likely played a central role in these administrative developments. The monumental complexes of the Yana and Anu precincts appear to have functioned as hubs for storage, redistribution, and labor coordination. The concentration of administrative tablets in these areas suggests that temples were not solely religious centers but also major economic institutions. Their involvement in record-keeping highlights the integration of economic and ideological authority in early urban governance. The scale of construction activities and the maintenance of irrigation networks would have required large workforces, further reinforcing the need for systematic accounting. Analytically, the emergence of proto-writing demonstrates a direct link between urban complexity and information management. As production and distribution expanded, tracking economic flows required durable, standardized records. The development of tablets and symbols reflects the capacity of institutions to adapt to increasing administrative demands. This transition represents a structural shift from oral or memory-based accounting to permanent, verifiable documentation, enabling more precise control over resources. It also marks the beginning of bureaucratic governance, in which information storage and retrieval became essential components of institutional power. The spread of these administrative practices beyond Uruk provides further evidence of their significance. Proto-writing tablets and related artifacts appear at sites across southern Mesopotamia and into neighboring regions, indicating that administrative technologies accompanied broader cultural expansion. This diffusion suggests that proto-writing was recognized as a valuable tool for managing economic systems and was adopted in areas influenced by Uruk's economic and political networks. The standardization of symbols across sites implies shared training or direct institutional connections, reinforcing the idea of a regional administrative framework. By the end of this period, the foundations of cuneiform writing were firmly established. The abstraction of pictographs, the refinement of numerical signs, and the formalization of tablet formats set the stage for phonetic elements that would appear in the subsequent early dynastic period. While these proto-writing systems remained restricted to administrative uses, their development marks a pivotal moment in human history, the creation of writing as a functional response to economic complexity. As administration advanced, Uruk influence spread beyond the alluvium. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the forces reshaping southern Mesopotamia did not remain confined to the banks of the Euphrates. As Uruk grew into a true urban center, its economic momentum radiated outward, drawing distant regions into new patterns of interaction. Archaeologists refer to this phenomenon as the Uruk expansion, a network of enclaves, trading stations, and cultural outposts that appeared across parts of Anatolia, Syria, and western Iran between roughly 3600 and 3200 BCE. Though not an empire in the political sense, this movement marked the first time a Mesopotamian society projected its influence hundreds of kilometers beyond its homeland, creating a recognizable cultural horizon across Southwest Asia. Material traces of this expansion are strikingly consistent. Distinctive beveled rim bowls, cylinder seal motifs, mass-produced pottery forms, and architectural layouts resembling southern Mesopotamian buildings appear far from the alluvium. Sites such as Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda along the Syrian Euphrates reveal walled settlements with rectilinear streets, storage facilities, and administrative spaces directly comparable to those in Uruk itself. Their sudden foundation and short occupation span suggest deliberate colonization rather than slow, local development. In these enclaves, Mesopotamian-style accounting tools, ration bowls, and ceilings point to a structured system of labor and resource distribution, hallmarks of Uruk administrative practice. Across the Zagros foothills and into western Iran, similar patterns can be observed. The site of Susa, though culturally distinct, shows strong Uruk period influences in pottery, seal iconography, and monumental architecture. Here, interaction appears to have been less colonial and more entangled. Local traditions merged with imported practices, producing hybrid material culture. Farther north, in regions like Anatolia, Uruk presence seems lighter, more akin to trade outposts tapping into networks rich in timber, metals, and stone. These variations suggest that the expansion was adaptive rather than uniform, shaped by local conditions, resources, and pre-existing social landscapes. The motivation behind this far-reaching movement remains a subject of scholarly debate, but several factors stand out. First, resource procurement played a critical role. Southern Mesopotamia lacked key raw materials: stone, metals, and hardwoods. Establishing enclaves along major routes allowed Uruk administrators to secure access to copper, obsidian, bitumen, and timber. Second, the growth of urban populations created new pressures. More people required more food, tools, and building materials. Long-distance exchange networks helped sustain the scale of Uruk's urban economy. Third, there may have been ideological incentives. Temple institutions in Uruk, increasingly central to economic life, likely sought to extend ritual and administrative authority, embedding their systems of measurement, redistribution, and labor organization into new territories. Evidence suggests that these outposts did not operate independently. Ceilings and clay tablets indicate flows of goods back toward the southern alluvium, implying coordinated oversight. Some settlements appear to have been founded rapidly and according to standardized plans, reinforcing the idea of centralized decision-making. Yet there is little indication of overt military control. Instead, influence spread through economic leverage, cultural prestige, and institutional practice, a soft but pervasive form of power. Crucially, the Uruk expansion also stimulated interregional interaction, not merely one-directional influence. Local societies in Syria, Iran, and Anatolia responded in diverse ways. Some adopted Mesopotamian accounting tools and pottery styles. Others blended southern forms with indigenous traditions. The result was a mosaic rather than a monoculture. At sites such as Godin Tepe in Iran, for example, imported Uruk materials coexist with local ceramics that reinterpret Mesopotamian shapes. This suggests negotiation, adaptation, and selective borrowing, evidence that peripheral communities were not passive recipients but active participants in a new interconnected world. In recent decades, scholars have begun to view the expansion not as a civilizing mission, but as a complex economic system linking regions with complementary resources. The rise of specialized craft production in Uruk, particularly in textiles, ceramics, and metallurgy, may have required reliable export channels and import streams. In turn, distant settlements gained access to prestige goods and administrative technologies that reshaped their own social structures. Some researchers argue that exposure to Uruk organizational methods helped catalyze emerging hierarchies in neighboring regions, accelerating the development of local elites who used imported symbols to legitimize authority. The collapse of many Uruk enclaves around 3200 BCE remains equally significant. Sites in Syria were abruptly abandoned, and administrative tools disappear from the archaeological record. The reasons are unclear. Climate shifts, overextension, local resistance, or changing trade dynamics may have played roles. Yet this contraction did not erase the legacy of the expansion. The networks forged during this period laid foundations for later interregional exchange, while the memory of Mesopotamian organizational power persisted. In hindsight, the Uruk expansion marks a turning point in ancient history, the moment when urbanism, administration, and long-distance interaction converged into a recognizable system. For the first time, a city's economic and cultural influence shaped landscapes far beyond its immediate surroundings. Even without formal empire, Uruk demonstrated that urban scale alone could generate a regional sphere of gravity. The networks, institutions, and cultural practices forged during this expansion created the groundwork for early political states, setting the stage for the emergence of dynastic authority in the centuries to come. By the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the urban world forged in the Uruk period no longer formed a loosely connected cultural horizon. Instead, southern Mesopotamia had fractured into a dense patchwork of independent city-states, each a walled center surrounded by agricultural hinterlands, outlying villages, irrigation networks, and competing claims to ancestral land. Rather than a unified territory, the region resembled a mosaic of rival polities. Uar, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Adab, Shuruppak, Kish, and others. These cities shared language, religious traditions, and material culture, yet they operated as distinct political entities. It is this moment, the early dynastic period, circa 2900 to 2600 BCE, that witnesses the rise of formal kingship and the emergence of political sovereignty in Mesopotamia. At the core of this transformation was a shift in authority. During earlier periods, the temple institution dominated economic and administrative life. Priestly officials oversaw land management, labor organization, and redistribution of agricultural goods. The temple complex was both ideological center and economic engine. However, as populations expanded and resource demands intensified, temple-based governance proved insufficient to manage intercity competition, defense, and large-scale irrigation. Administrative tablets from sites such as Shuruppak and Uruk show increasingly complex records of labor, weaponry, and military provisioning, evidence that new forms of leadership were emerging. It is within this context that the office of the Lugal, literally big man, rises to prominence. Unlike the earlier Ensi, a governor-like figure tied to temple administration, the Lugal embodied secular rulership and military authority. Royal inscriptions from the period depict the king not as a priestly caretaker but as a commander, judge, and protector of the polis. While temples continued to wield ideological influence, practical power shifted toward individuals who could mobilize labor, negotiate alliances, and defend territory. This transition marks the institutional birth of kingship in the political sense. Archaeology reinforces the significance of this shift. Across multiple city-states, early dynastic strata reveal fortification walls, bastions, and gates, physical expressions of geopolitical anxiety. The construction of these defenses required centralized planning and coordinated labor, suggesting leaders capable of mobilizing thousands. Weapon production proliferates as well. Excavations at Kish, Lagash, and other sites show caches of spearheads, axes, and standardized projectile points. The appearance of organized military equipment signals that conflict between cities was no longer episodic but persistent. Texts echo this martial reality. The Sumerian king list, though composed later and shaped by ideological motives, preserves the memory of competitive claims to political supremacy. It presents kingship as a transferable institution. When kingship was lowered from heaven, it was in Eridu, later shifting to Kish, then to other cities. While not a literal record, the list captures an essential truth. City-states vied for hegemony, and legitimacy was contested. The repeated emphasis on Kish as a dominant power suggests its early prominence in asserting superregional authority, possibly due to its strategic position near northern trade routes and the boundary between Sumerian and Semitic-speaking populations. Competition was not driven solely by prestige. Agricultural land and irrigation rights formed the economic backbone of every city-state, and access to water was a strategic asset. Along the lower Tigris and Euphrates, river courses shifted, fields required constant maintenance, and canals had to be regulated. As populations soared, the margin for agricultural failure narrowed. Control over irrigation infrastructure, canals, dikes, sluices, became synonymous with power. Administrative tablets from Lagash and detail disputes over field boundaries and water access, underscoring how ecological pressure translated into political conflict. This dynamic helps explain why leadership evolved beyond temple stewardship. Large-scale hydraulic systems demanded decision-making, enforcement, and coordination that exceeded religious administration. Kingship emerged as a solution to the logistical challenges of dense urban settlement, specialized economies, and the need for collective defense. In many cities, rulers appear to have legitimized their authority by aligning with, rather than replacing, the temple. Kings adopted divine patronage, claimed favor from deities like Inanna, Enlil, and Ningirsu, and sponsored temple construction to reinforce ideological legitimacy. Economic specialization contributed to this political evolution as well. Early dynastic cities supported full-time craftsmen, administrators, and merchants. Metallurgy, textile production, and long-distance trade required regulation and protection. Military leadership allowed kings to secure goods and trade routes, further cementing their authority. Over time, the king became the arbiter of labor, law, and land, roles that once belonged to temple institutions but now rested in royal hands. The archaeological record also hints at emerging elite hierarchies. Sumptuous burials, particularly the royal tombs at Ur, though slightly later in date, reflect the consolidation of wealth and status among ruling families. Prestige goods, gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, testify to both long-distance exchange and social stratification. These material markers illustrate how kingship was not merely administrative but deeply embedded in social identity and hierarchy. Yet political fragmentation did not preclude shared cultural frameworks. Despite rivalry, the cities of southern Mesopotamia remained linked through religion, language, and economic interdependence. Ritual festivals drew participants from multiple regions, and scribal traditions circulated administrative techniques. The tension between shared heritage and competitive independence shaped Mesopotamian political life for centuries. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the stage was set for increasing conflict. City-states that once competed symbolically would soon wage organized warfare over fields, canals, and regional dominance. The emergence of kingship thus marks not only a solution to urban pressures, but also the beginning of a new era of diplomatic negotiation, territorial ambition, and military engagement. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia consisted of dozens of competing urban polities. As agricultural land and water rights grew more valuable, rivalry between cities escalated into direct conflict, shaping the first recorded interstate wars in human history. Control of arable land and irrigation canals became central drivers of urban conflict. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, military competition among Mesopotamian city-states had become a defining feature of regional politics. Urban growth, population pressures, and dependence on canal-based agriculture intensified disputes over boundaries and resource access. Unlike earlier episodic hostilities, conflicts in this period were structured, recurring, and increasingly documented. The most detailed evidence comes from the rivalry between Lagash and Umma, two adjacent Sumerian polities located along the fertile Guadina plain. Their struggle illustrates how competition for arable land and water transformed intercity relations into organized warfare, supported by administrative systems, military leadership, and emerging diplomatic mechanisms. The economic basis of these conflicts can be traced to the material demands of irrigation agriculture. Fields along the Tigris-Euphrates alluvium required constant maintenance, and canal routes determined which city controlled productive farmland. Shifting watercourses and sediment buildup altered boundaries over time, creating recurring disputes. Administrative tablets from Lagash record calculations of field areas, grain yields, and labor quotas associated with canal repair, indicating that agricultural productivity was inseparable from hydraulic regulation. As cities expanded, the margin of cultivable land narrowed, making territorial control an existential concern. Warfare became a tool for protecting and expanding access to resources essential for urban survival. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that by this period, Mesopotamian warfare had developed organized structures. Royal inscriptions describe ranks of infantry, standardized weapons, and leadership hierarchies. Administrative records from Lagash reference rations, often barley and oil, allocated to soldiers, implying the presence of professional or semi-permanent military forces rather than temporary levies. This marks a transition from ad hoc militias to more sustained military organization. The emergence of specialized weapon workshops, revealed through metallurgical remains, suggests that certain cities invested directly in the production of arms as part of state infrastructure. The most significant primary source for this phase of conflict is the Stele of the Vultures, erected by Eonatum of Lagash. The monument depicts formations of armored infantry advancing in phalanx-like ranks, led by the king. Although symbolic in presentation, it provides visual testimony that warfare involved disciplined troop movements and centralized command. Inscriptions accompanying the imagery recount Eonatum's campaign against Umma and assert Lagash's right to disputed land based on earlier boundary agreements. The stele records the digging of a canal to demarcate territory and the imposition of tribute on Umma, illustrating how military victory was intertwined with economic and administrative outcomes. This conflict also highlights the use of fortifications and siege tactics. Archaeological evidence from several city sites reveals defensive walls, ditches, and gate complexes constructed during this period. Though detailed accounts of sieges are limited, references in later texts imply that capturing fortified cities required sustained campaigns, suggesting logistical capabilities such as supply provisioning and labor coordination. The existence of battering implements depicted in some fragments indicates early experimentation with siege equipment, marking an evolution in offensive strategy. Beyond battlefields, diplomacy emerged as a parallel mechanism for managing intercity relations. Fragmentary texts refer to treaty agreements specifying boundary lines, canal rights, and tribute obligations. In the case of Lagash and Umma, the Steel of the Vultures describes a treaty that involved religious sanction, invoking deities such as Ningirsu to enforce compliance. This use of divine witnesses suggests that diplomacy aimed to stabilize political arrangements by embedding them within shared religious frameworks. Diplomatic marriages, though poorly documented, appear in later traditions and may have originated in this period as tools for alliance formation. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma further illustrates how rulership and warfare reinforced one another. Kings claimed legitimacy through military success, and inscriptions emphasized the monarch's role as protector of land and temple property. Victory in war strengthened royal authority, while defeat could destabilize leadership. This dynamic contributed to the institutionalization of kingship as a political office defined not only by administrative responsibility but by command over armed forces. Military conflict also stimulated advancements in mobility and transport. While fully developed chariots would emerge later, some texts and iconographic materials suggest the use of four-wheeled wagons drawn by equids for battlefield movement or logistical support. These vehicles likely served as precursors to later chariot technology and reflect increasing attention to speed and maneuverability in warfare. Their deployment indicates the growing complexity of military operations and the resources required to sustain them. The consequences of continued conflict extended beyond territorial gains. Warfare accelerated the development of bureaucratic systems as cities sought to manage taxation, conscription, and resource allocation. Administrative tablets recorded grain distributions to soldiers and laborers, indicating that the military was integrated into state-controlled economic networks. The need to fund campaigns and maintain defenses contributed to more systematic accounting and reinforced centralized authority. In this sense, warfare functioned as a catalyst for administrative expansion, shaping the evolution of early state institutions. Despite recurring hostilities, intercity relations were not exclusively antagonistic. Trade continued to flow across the region, and shared religious and cultural practices linked communities. Nippur, as the cult center of Enlil, maintains symbolic significance and may have served as a neutral ritual focal point. This coexistence of competition and connectivity underscores the complexity of early dynastic politics, where cities balanced rivalry with mutual dependence. By approximately 2450 BCE, the long-standing conflict between Lagash and Umma persisted, with power shifting between rulers and territories. The struggle exemplified broader patterns across Mesopotamia, where competition for land, water, and political dominance shaped the trajectory of urban development. Warfare had become a constant feature of interstate interaction, reinforcing kingship, administrative centralization, and territorial ambition. For viewers analyzing early state warfare, continued conflict encouraged cities to expand administrative capacity, creating conditions that would support increasingly complex political structures in the centuries that followed. City-states transformed into complex bureaucratic systems supported by trained administrators. Between 2500 and 2350 BCE, Mesopotamian city-states entered a phase marked not only by continued political rivalry, but by substantial cultural and administrative consolidation. While military competition remained visible, archaeological and textual evidence indicates that the internal organization of cities such as Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and Kish became increasingly systematic. This period saw advances in standardized measurement, expanded temple-based economies, the refinement of cuneiform writing, and the emergence of specialized bureaucratic training. These developments suggest that urban governance matured into structured administrative systems capable of managing labor, resources, taxation, and ritual obligations across large populations. One of the most significant transformations involved the standardization of weights and measures. Administrative tablets from cities across southern Mesopotamia show consistent use of numerical systems to quantify grain rations, livestock, textiles, and metal goods. The widespread adoption of standardized weight units, such as the jin and mina, indicates coordinated systems of economic accounting. Cylinder seals and ration lists demonstrate that officials track distributions using uniform metrics, reducing ambiguity in taxation and state provisioning. The appearance of similar measurement systems across multiple city-states implies shared economic conventions, possibly transmitted through scribal practice or intercity commerce. This administrative consistency marks an important step toward reliable, large-scale economic management. Parallel to these developments, the cuneiform script underwent refinement. Earlier pictographic signs evolved into more abstract, wedge-shaped forms better suited for rapid inscription on clay tablets. Texts from the mid-3rd millennium BCE display increasingly complex grammatical structures, enabling documentation of legal contracts, land agreements, and temple inventories. The expansion of sign lists and lexical tablets suggests that scribes required formal learning to master the system. Administrative records from Shuruppak and Ur indicate that governments relied heavily on written documentation to manage property transfers, labor assignments, and agricultural yields. Writing thus shifted from a narrow accounting tool to a versatile administrative instrument, supporting broader state functions. This shift was closely tied to the growth of scribal education. Excavated school tablets, often containing repetitive writing exercises, provide direct evidence of formalized training. Typical practice sequences included repeated numerical signs, grain measures, and simple legal formulas. The standardized nature of these exercises suggests that scribal instruction followed shared curricula. The existence of dedicated training areas, identified by concentrations of practice tablets, indicates that scribes formed a distinct professional class. As bureaucratic tasks expanded, literacy became a prerequisite for administrative roles, reinforcing a hierarchy in which scribes served as intermediaries between rulers, temples, and economic institutions. The development of scribal schools marks a pivotal moment in the institutionalization of knowledge within the state apparatus. Administrative complexity was further reinforced by the expanding role of temple economies. Temples functioned as major landholders, labor coordinators, and centers of redistribution. Tablets from Lagash during the reigns of Ur-Nansha and Eonatum detail extensive temple inventories, including grain stores, livestock herds, and workshops producing textiles and ceramics. These records indicate that temples managed large workforces and directed production for both local use and regional exchange. The Temple of Ningirsu in Lagash, for example, oversaw agricultural plots worked by dependent laborers, whose outputs were measured and redistributed through ration systems. The scale of these operations required coordinated administration, linking religious authority with economic management. At the same time, evidence from elite tombs reveals increasing social stratification. The Royal Cemetery of Ur, excavated in the early 20th century and dated primarily to this period, contains elaborate burials featuring gold ornaments, lapis lazuli inlays, ceremonial weapons, and lyres. The presence of valuable materials imported from regions such as Afghanistan and Iran implies long-distance trade regulated or facilitated by ruling elites. Some graves also contained human retainers, likely sacrificial attendants buried alongside the deceased. These practices signal a clear differentiation between social tiers, with elites asserting status through funerary displays. The material record reflects a society in which wealth, authority, and religious symbolism became concentrated within narrow leadership groups. Administrative records also document specialization in labor and craft production. Tablets list categories of workers, such as metal workers, carpenters, and textile weavers, assigned to institutional households. This suggests that economic activity was not solely decentralized or household-based. Instead, Centralized authorities coordinated sectors of production. Specialized workshops attached to temples and palaces produced standardized goods, likely used both locally and for exchange. This degree of specialization required systematic oversight, illustrating the integration of economic and administrative functions within city-state governance. Another critical development was the emergence of legal and regulatory frameworks. Although no comprehensive law code survives from this exact period, fragmentary legal texts record disputes over land boundaries, debt obligations, and labor arrangements. These documents indicate that written agreements served as binding records, authenticated through seals. Seal impressions on tablets and storage jars functioned as markers of ownership and authorization, ensuring accountability in administrative transactions. The proliferation of seals across multiple social strata suggests that legal documentation extended beyond the palace and temple, embedding itself in broader commercial life. The cumulative effect of these transformations was the creation of ideological cohesion. Temples, rulers, and administrators articulated authority through shared symbols, ritual practices, and written records. Inscriptions frequently linked political power to divine sanction, presenting kings as stewards of the gods' properties and guarantors of social order. This ideological framework helped legitimize centralized control over land, labor, and production. Administrative efficiency was thus reinforced by religious narratives that positioned governance as a sacred duty. These developments also promoted interconnectedness among city-states. Shared scripts, measurement systems, and administrative conventions facilitated trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. While political autonomy remained intact, the region's cities operated within a common cultural and bureaucratic framework. This convergence suggests that Mesopotamia was moving toward a more integrated regional system, even before territorial unification. By 2350 BCE, the cultural and administrative foundations of the city-states were well established. Standardized accounting, professionalized scribal institutions, temple-based economies, and stratified social structures created states capable of managing large populations and complex resource networks. These advancements did not eliminate rivalry, but they enabled more sophisticated governance and more stable economic oversight. For viewers focused on early governance and social hierarchy, these foundations set the stage for the first territorial empire, where centralized authority would extend beyond individual cities to encompass the broader Mesopotamian landscape. Akkad marked the first known attempt to govern Mesopotamia as a unified territorial state. In the late 3rd millennium BCE, when Mesopotamia was still a mosaic of competing city-states, a new political experiment began to take shape, one unlike anything the region had witnessed before. From the northern lowlands emerged a ruler named Sargon, a figure whom later scribes would remember as both conqueror and architect, a king who transformed scattered riverine settlements into a single territorial entity. Though the details of his early life drift between history and legend, the world he fashioned was concrete. A centralized authority stretching across the floodplains, anchored not merely in conquest, but in administration, policy, and sustained governance. Before Sargon, power in southern Mesopotamia belonged to cities, Ur, Lagash, Uruk, Kish, each with its own rulers, temples, and traditions. Political spheres rarely extended beyond local irrigation systems and defensive walls. Even when coalitions formed, they remained temporary, dissolving as alliances shifted with harvests and rivalries. Authority was fragmented. Identity was civic, not regional. What Sargon envisioned would break that pattern. According to later chronicles, Sargon began as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position that, in the Near Eastern courts, often implied proximity to power and military command. Whether or not the legendary story of his humble origins is true, what follows is better grounded in inscriptions and administrative records. Sargon seized control of Kish and used its northern position to launch military campaigns southward. The decisive turning point was the defeat of Lugal-Zagizi of Umma, a ruler who had briefly united much of Sumer under his banner. Sargon not only overcame this rival but symbolically marched him to Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, asserting divine legitimacy over the broader Sumerian religious landscape. It is in such gestures, conquest paired with ritual authority, that we glimpse the framework of a territorial state taking form. Once the Sumerian cities were subdued, Sargon founded a new capital, Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown, but whose legacy is unmistakable. By shifting the center of power away from the traditional Sumerian heartland, Sargon signaled a new political order, one that transcended old urban hierarchies. The capital became the administrative hub of a domain far larger than any earlier polity. Royal inscriptions describe Akkad not merely as a seat of kingship but as the nucleus of a network that linked distant regions by military command, tribute, and communication. Sargon's empire was expansive, extending along the Euphrates towards Syria and the Anatolian foothills, and eastward into Elam. These campaigns were not raids but sustained operations, evidenced by references to standing armies and garrisons. The Akkadian rulers established control over trade routes moving timber, metals, and stones, resources scarce in southern Mesopotamia yet vital for monumental construction and elite display. This territorial reach suggests not just domination but strategy. Control over the landscape was tied directly to economic lifelines. However, military conquest alone cannot explain Akkad's longevity. Sargon implemented administrative systems that altered how authority functioned. He appointed loyal officials, Ensi and Sakanaku, to govern conquered cities, replacing local dynasties with a hierarchy answerable to the royal court. This was a fundamental shift. Instead of independent rulers negotiating power as equals, cities became provinces under central oversight. It was an early model of imperial administration, wherein legitimacy flowed downward from a single sovereign. Royal inscriptions further emphasized that Sargon standardized tribute and labor obligations, creating predictable flows of resources to the capital. Some scholars suggest that Akkad pioneered new methods of record-keeping, building on earlier Sumerian practices but applying them across a broader territory. The volume of administrative tablets from later Akkadian levels points to bureaucratic intensification, scribes tracking goods, personnel, and movement along state-controlled channels. In this emerging system, the written word became not just a tool of temple economy, but an instrument of political control. Sargon also cultivated ideological unity. Titles like King of the Four Quarters projected notions of universal rule, framing the Akkadian state as more than a regional power. Whether this title was literal, symbolic, or aspirational, it conveyed a vision of kingship that transcended local boundaries. Inscriptions and later narratives portray Sargon as chosen by Ishtar, suggesting that divine favor legitimized not only his conquests but the very structure of imperial centralization. Religion became a medium through which territorial authority was stabilized. Despite the grand scale of his achievements, Sargon faced resistance. Rebellions are recorded in several cities during his reign, reminders that centralization was both ambitious and fragile. Yet the persistence of his rule, and the continuation of Akkadian authority under his successors, demonstrates that the mechanisms he introduced were resilient enough to endure beyond immediate military dominance. Even in opposition, the concept of unified rule had taken root. By the end of Sargon's reign around 2279 BCE, Mesopotamia had undergone a profound transformation. Political identity was no longer confined to urban walls. There was, for the first time, a sense of territory governed under a single sovereign power, sustained by administrators, armies, and ideology. The Akkadian experiment would influence later states, from Babylon to Assyria, providing a template for how power could be organized across distance and diversity. In the stillness of this early imperial landscape, one can sense a turning point, the shift from localized city-states to expansive, centralized governance. Though the capital of Akkad would eventually fade, the administrative logic it pioneered continued to shape Mesopotamian history for centuries. Imperial expansion required new administrative mechanisms. Akkadian rulers developed systems to manage diverse regions under centralized authority. When Sargon's successors inherited the vast Akkadian realm, they also inherited its greatest challenge: distance. Cities, river valleys, and trade routes now stretched far beyond the horizons of earlier Mesopotamian politics. To rule this landscape required more than armies. It required a system, one capable of binding together communities that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived in environments as varied as the irrigated south and the mountainous frontiers of Anatolia and Iran. During the reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, this challenge began to crystallize into something unprecedented, a deliberate architecture of imperial governance. Naram-Sin's reign, roughly between 2254 and 2218 BCE, is often remembered for military victories and royal grandeur. Yet his most enduring legacy lies in administration. If Sargon created the idea of a territorial state, Naram-Sin refined its machinery. By this period, the Akkadian realm was no longer a loose collection of conquered cities, but a set of provinces linked through standardized systems of oversight, resource extraction, and ideological messaging. The empire was learning how to manage itself. A central pillar of this system was the expanding role of provincial governors, officials referred to as Sakanaku. Although the title originated in earlier contexts, under Naram-Sin it gained sharper definition and broader reach. These governors were not independent rulers. They were agents of the king, responsible for taxation, labor mobilization, military recruitment, and the enforcement of imperial directives. Their authority was tethered to the capital, and their position depended on loyalty. In some regions, archaeological evidence suggests the installation of Akkadian personnel rather than local elites, marking a deliberate shift towards centralized control. Taxation illustrates how this administrative integration functioned. Instead of haphazard tribute or irregular levies, the Akkadian state developed more predictable systems of redistribution. Grain, livestock, and crafted goods flowed from provincial centers toward the capital, where they were recorded, stored, and redirected. Some resources supported the court and military, while others were dispatched to temples or used to provision garrisons along frontier routes. This circulation of goods transformed the empire into an economic organism, its arteries traced through clay tablets and warehouse entries. The state was no longer just gathering wealth, it was coordinating it. To sustain this complexity, Akkadian administrators relied on standardized documentation. Earlier Mesopotamian cities already used cuneiform tablets for temple accounting, but under Naram-Sin the scale widened. Administrative texts increased in number and geographic distribution. Seals bearing the names of officials appear across distant regions, implying a network of record-keeping unified by recognizable titles and procedures. Even the format of tablets, columns, numerical systems, and terminology shows signs of uniformity, suggesting efforts to align bureaucratic practices across provincial boundaries. In this sense, writing became a connective tissue of empire. It allowed distant officials to communicate with the court, track obligations, and justify decisions. Authority was no longer conveyed solely through face-to-face command or military presence, but through inscribed directives that outlasted any single campaign. Bureaucracy turned governance into something stable, repeatable, and crucially legible across distance. Naram-Sin also reshaped the ideological framework of kingship to reinforce this administrative order. His adoption of the title King of the Four Quarters, and, more dramatically, his portrayal as a divine figure marked a new phase in royal representation. For the first time in Mesopotamian history, a living ruler was depicted wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for gods. This elevation was not merely symbolic grandeur, it served an administrative purpose. By framing the king as a divine authority, obedience to the state became woven into the fabric of cosmic order. Provincial governors and local officials were not just serving a monarch. They were participating in a sacred hierarchy that legitimized the entire system of rule. Monumental art reflected this ideology. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, carved with ascending soldiers and a commanding ruler crowned with divine horns, projects a clear message. The king stands above human conflict, a stabilizing force guiding the empire's destiny. Such imagery was more than celebration. It communicated imperial values to diverse audiences, many of whom had limited direct contact with the capital. Art became a medium of governance, reinforcing authority where armies and scribes could not always reach. Administrative integration also extended into military organization. Rather than relying solely on ad hoc levies, the empire appears to have maintained more permanent forces stationed in key regions. Governors oversaw recruitment and provisioning, ensuring that soldiers could be mobilized quickly in response to unrest or external threats. Frontier zones, particularly along the Tigris and Upper Euphrates, held strategic importance, serving as buffers as well as conduits for trade. The presence of Akkadian officials and garrisons in these areas indicates an early form of territorial defense planning, one coordinated through the administrative network rather than dictated by isolated city-states. Despite these advances, governance was not static. Naram-Sin issued reforms to address internal instability, including episodes of rebellion documented in later inscriptions. The king's response appears to have involved both force and reorganization, reassigning officials, strengthening oversight, and possibly altering tax expectations in volatile regions. Integration, then, was an ongoing process, a balancing act between central authority and regional realities. Religious policy further supported administrative unity. Temples, long-standing centers of economic power, were drawn into the imperial framework. Some were placed under the supervision of Akkadian appointees. Others received redistributed goods from the state. By aligning sacred institutions with royal authority, the empire harnessed existing networks of trust and legitimacy. Spiritual life did not replace governance, but it helped stabilize it. By the early 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian state possessed a level of coordination unseen in earlier Mesopotamian history. Distant regions were connected through written orders, standardized taxation, and a shared visual language of power. The capital no longer ruled through conquest alone, but through systems, administrative, economic, ideological, that allowed the empire to function even when the king was absent. Governance had become infrastructure. Yet beneath this expanding framework lay vulnerabilities. The greater the territory, the heavier the burden of oversight. Provinces strained under resource demands. Communication depended on fragile networks, and ideological unity could falter in times of crisis. The empire had mastered the art of integration, but it had also grown more dependent on stability, environmental, political, and economic. Environmental and political pressures destabilized the empire. By the early 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian system faced multiple converging crises. Following the administrative innovations and territorial consolidation of Sargon and Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire entered a period of instability during the reigns of later kings. By approximately 2210 BCE, the empire confronted a series of overlapping challenges, political, military, and environmental, that undermined the systems that had enabled centralized control. The mechanisms of provincial governance, taxation, and military oversight, once highly effective, were strained beyond capacity, exposing vulnerabilities inherent in the early model of imperial administration. Textual evidence and archaeological indicators point to widespread internal revolts as a primary factor in the empire's decline. Several inscriptions from city-states formerly under Akkadian control describe uprisings against provincial governors, Sakanaku, sometimes coordinated across multiple regions. In some cases, these revolts were violent, involving sieges, destruction of official structures, and temporary seizure of local grain stores. The rapid succession of kings following Naram-Sin suggests that political legitimacy became increasingly contested, with internal dissent eroding centralized authority. Administrative continuity suffered, as fewer tablets survived from this period, indicating a breakdown in routine record-keeping and resource management. Concurrently, the empire faced external pressure from the Gutians, a group of highland communities originating in the Zagros Mountains. Gutian incursions intensified in the early 22nd century BCE, exploiting weakened provincial defenses and overextended supply lines. Archaeological surveys reveal fortified settlements in northern and central Mesopotamia that appear hastily constructed or strengthened in response to repeated raids. Inscriptions from contemporaneous rulers describe punitive expeditions, yet the Gutians' persistent movements suggest that Akkadian military presence was insufficient to stabilize frontier regions. This combination of external threat and internal unrest created a feedback loop, further straining provincial administration and undermining royal authority. Environmental factors likely compounded these political and military pressures. Recent paleoenvironmental research, including lake sediment cores and isotopic analysis, indicates a significant episode of aridification in northern and central Mesopotamia around 2200 to 2150 BCE. Reduced rainfall and declining river flow would have impacted irrigation-dependent agriculture, decreasing grain yields and intensifying competition over water resources. Administrative tablets from the late Akkadian period document irregular grain distributions and notes of shortages, suggesting that climatic stress translated directly into social and political instability. The combination of environmental stress, population demands, and ongoing conflict placed unprecedented strain on the empire's infrastructure. These converging crises are reflected in the sharp decline of administrative documentation. Whereas previous decades produced extensive cuneiform tablets recording taxes, labor obligations, and temple inventories, surviving records from the final decades of Akkad are sporadic and fragmented. The diminution of documentation indicates both a collapse in bureaucratic function and a reduced capacity to coordinate provincial affairs. Without consistent oversight, provincial governors and local elites increasingly acted autonomously, further eroding centralized authority. Monumental inscriptions and reliefs suggest that royal ideology persisted in rhetoric, if not in practice. Later kings of Akkad continued to depict themselves as divinely sanctioned rulers commanding armies and enforcing order. However, the disconnect between symbolic authority and operational control became increasingly evident. Fortified centers became refuges for local elites rather than instruments of imperial cohesion, and tribute flows were irregular, undermining the economic foundations of the state. By around 2154 BCE, the cumulative effect of internal revolts, Gutian incursions, and environmental stress had effectively dismantled the Akkadian administrative system. The empire's territory fragmented, cities regained political autonomy, and the mechanisms of centralized governance, standardized taxation, provincial oversight, and coordinated military logistics, collapsed. The collapse illustrates the challenges faced by early territorial states: the difficulty of maintaining cohesion across diverse regions, the vulnerability of resource-dependent economies to climatic fluctuations, and the dependence of administrative systems on both military enforcement and continuous bureaucratic infrastructure. Despite this collapse, the Akkadian period left enduring legacies. The conceptual framework of territorial rule, administrative hierarchy, and centralized ideology informed later Mesopotamian polities. The notion of a ruler governing multiple cities through appointed officials, supported by a professional bureaucracy, reappeared under the Third Dynasty of Ur and subsequent states. Even as Akkad itself faded from prominence, the principles of imperial administration persisted, demonstrating that political collapse did not erase institutional knowledge. In sum, the early 22nd century BCE represents a critical juncture in Mesopotamian history. The Akkadian Empire illustrates both the possibilities and limits of early centralized authority. Its decline was not a singular event but the outcome of interlocking pressures: political fragmentation, external incursions, and environmental stress. The dismantling of Akkad's systems created a political vacuum, setting the stage for the resurgence of southern Mesopotamian city-states and the emergence of the Neo-Sumerian state centered at Ur, which would build upon and refine the administrative and ideological innovations of the Akkadian era. For viewers studying collapse dynamics in early complex states, in the aftermath, a new centralized state emerged in Ur. The Ur-III state represented a deliberate effort to restore organized governance across Sumer and Akkad. In the aftermath of the Akkadian collapse, southern Mesopotamia entered a period of political fragmentation, marked by independent city-states and weakened central authority. This landscape changed dramatically with the rise of Ur-Namma, founder of the Third Dynasty of Ur, circa 2112 BCE, who undertook a systematic program of reunification. Drawing upon the administrative and ideological precedents of the Akkadian Empire, Ur-Namma restored central control over the Sumerian city-states, while asserting authority over parts of the former Akkadian territory. His reign combined military consolidation, legal innovation, and extensive building projects, establishing a blueprint for one of Mesopotamia's most administratively sophisticated states. Uarnama's consolidation of power involved both military campaigns and strategic diplomacy. Textual evidence indicates that he suppressed rival city-states while integrating their administrative personnel into a broader bureaucratic framework. Inscriptions from Uar describe victories over rebellious polities, while appointments of loyal governors, Sagina, ensured that local affairs remained aligned with royal directives. The combination of force and institutional oversight allowed the state to maintain both territorial cohesion and functional governance across a region previously fragmented by conflict. Central to Uarnama's program was the standardization of legal and administrative systems. He is traditionally credited with codifying a set of laws, the so-called Code of Uarnama, which predated and influenced later Mesopotamian legal texts. These laws addressed property rights, labor obligations, debt, and family relations, providing a structured framework for dispute resolution across the state. Written in Sumerian and applied uniformly, the code strengthened the authority of the central administration and reinforced the role of provincial officials as enforcers of royal policy. Its provisions illustrate the integration of social, economic, and legal control into a cohesive bureaucratic system. Uarnama's reign also witnessed large-scale construction and restoration projects, which served both practical and ideological purposes. The city of Uar became the administrative and religious center of the state, with new temple complexes, ziggurats, and palace facilities constructed or renovated. Excavations reveal that temples at Uar, Nippur, and Amma were expanded and incorporated into state-controlled economic networks. These projects provided employment, mobilized labor across multiple sectors, and reinforced the symbolic presence of the king and central authority. Monumental inscriptions accompanying these constructions emphasized the king's role as both protector and restorer of divine and civic order. Shulgi, Uarnama's successor, continued and expanded these reforms, formalizing administrative processes and increasing state efficiency. Under Shulgi, the Uar III state developed a comprehensive provincial hierarchy, with governors, inspectors, and scribes overseeing production, distribution, and labor. Cuneiform archives from the period, particularly from Amma, Puzrishtagon, and Nippur, demonstrate meticulous accounting of grain rations, livestock, textiles, and metal resources. These records indicate that the state maintained precise control over both urban centers and rural hinterlands, ensuring that economic outputs supported the central administration and temple institutions. Shulgi also emphasized centralization of labor and taxation, standardizing contributions from provincial regions. Workers were allocated to temple and palace projects, while officials documented grain deliveries, craft production, and military provisioning. The regularity and scale of these records suggest a bureaucracy capable of sustained oversight across the empire. In addition to economic control, Shulgi integrated military organization into the administrative framework, maintaining garrisons and mobilizing troops efficiently, reinforcing the state's capacity to respond to rebellion or external threat. Another hallmark of the Uar III period was the institutionalization of scribal education and record-keeping. School tablets, lexical lists, and practice exercises reveal that the state actively trained scribes to operate within the bureaucratic system. These scribes were essential intermediaries between the central administration and provincial centers, ensuring that information flowed accurately and efficiently. Their work reinforced standardization in accounting, legal documentation, and correspondence, enhancing administrative consistency and reducing the risk of localized corruption or inefficiency. The Uar III state also pursued cultural and ideological consolidation. Temple and palace inscriptions frequently portrayed the king as divinely appointed, linking governance with religious legitimacy. Festivals, cult practices, and temple rituals were coordinated under central supervision, aligning civic and spiritual life with state objectives. This integration of ideology and administration helped stabilize the empire, providing a framework in which loyalty, productivity, and religious devotion supported one another. By the conclusion of Shulgi's reign, circa 2047 BCE, the UR3 state had achieved remarkable bureaucratic and territorial integration. Military, economic, legal, and religious systems functioned as interconnected mechanisms of governance, demonstrating the durability of central authority after the disruption of the Akkadian collapse. Administrative efficiency, standardized procedures, and hierarchical oversight allowed the state to manage diverse populations and extensive agricultural territories across the Tigris-Euphrates alluvium. For viewers focused on post-collapse reconstruction and the emergence of highly organized bureaucratic states, a more complex administrative structure emerged, expanding record-keeping, provincial governance, and resource mobilization to unprecedented levels. UR3 bureaucracy produced one of the largest cuneiform archives in history. Following the reunification of Sumer under Ur-Nama and Shulgi, the UR3 state entered a period defined by intensive administrative management and economic centralization. Between c. 2047 and 2000 BCE, provincial governors, temple administrators, and royal officials coordinated complex systems of labor, taxation, and resource distribution. These mechanisms were not ad hoc. They represented a deliberate, institutionalized effort to organize agricultural production, regulate craft specialization, and maintain social order across a densely populated, resource-dependent territory. The result is one of the most extensive archaeological archives of administrative texts in human history, providing detailed insight into early state-level economic systems. Central to UR3 governance was the rationing system, which allocated food and supplies to temple personnel, workers, and military garrisons. Textual evidence, particularly from the administrative center of Puzrishdagon, shows that livestock, including cattle, sheep, and goats, was collected from rural producers and redistributed, according to meticulously recorded schedules. The Puzrishdagon tablets list the origins, destinations, and purposes of individual animals, demonstrating a highly organized system capable of tracking thousands of units across multiple provinces. Such redistribution ensured that laborers, officials, and artisans were provisioned reliably, facilitating ongoing construction projects, agricultural work, and craft production. Labor mobilization extended beyond routine provisioning. Seasonal and permanent workforces were directed to temple construction, canal maintenance, and palace projects. Tablets record assignments by name, occupation, and the quantities of rations allocated, suggesting that labor organization relied on formalized bureaucratic oversight rather than local or informal arrangements. Workers' efforts were monitored through detailed accounting, allowing administrators to calculate contributions, monitor compliance, and adjust assignments as necessary. This degree of control enabled the state to mobilize human resources on a scale unattainable by earlier city-states or the Akkadian Empire. Agricultural quotas were similarly regulated. UR3 records include systematic assessments of land productivity, water allocation, and expected grain yields. Officials assigned plots to farmers and monitored harvest outputs, often using standard measures such as the gur and sila to ensure consistency. Surpluses were collected and redistributed to temples, royal estates, and urban populations, stabilizing both local subsistence and state revenue. These practices reflect a deliberate attempt to integrate irrigation management, production expectations, and resource allocation into a unified economic system. The standardization of accounting practices was a defining feature of UR3 bureaucracy. Numerical systems, administrative terminology, and tablet formats were consistent across regions, enabling effective communication between central authorities and provincial offices. This uniformity facilitated audits, streamlined record-keeping, and reduced the potential for mismanagement or corruption. Evidence from multiple sites, including Umma, Nippur, and Lagash, demonstrates that these practices were applied across both urban and rural contexts, reinforcing the state's ability to exercise authority over diverse populations. Scribal training was integral to the functioning of this bureaucracy. Pervasive use of lexical lists, practice tablets, and standardized forms indicates a highly professionalized scribal class capable of managing complex economic data. Scribes documented livestock movements, grain allocations, labor assignments, and craft production, ensuring that every transaction and obligation was verifiable. This institutional literacy not only enabled administrative efficiency but also created a durable record of state operations, contributing to the preservation of Mesopotamia's most comprehensive cuneiform archive. Economic management was further supported by temple coordination. Temples served as both production centers and redistribution hubs, integrating religious, economic, and administrative functions. Temple estates supplied artisans, maintained workshops, and collected agricultural produce from affiliated villages. Records show that temples worked in tandem with royal administration, providing both material resources and ideological legitimacy. This alignment of religious and state functions reinforced the authority of the central government and streamlined resource flows. The scale and complexity of UR3 administration, while highly effective, also introduced structural vulnerabilities. Managing such extensive networks required constant oversight, reliable communication, and disciplined adherence to procedure. Any disruption, whether from environmental fluctuations, labor shortages, or local resistance, had the potential to cascade through the system. Evidence from late UR3 tablets indicates occasional deviations from expected rations and irregularities in livestock distribution, hinting at growing administrative strain. These challenges foreshadow the difficulties the state would encounter as the dynasty approached its decline. By c. 2000 BCE, UR3 economic systems exemplified the capacities and limits of early centralized governance. The meticulous rationing of resources, mobilization of labor, and standardized accounting allowed the state to sustain large populations, ambitious construction projects, and long-distance trade networks. Yet the very sophistication of this bureaucracy contributed to its eventual fragility, as environmental pressures, social unrest, and political challenges intensified. Maintaining the extensive administrative apparatus became increasingly difficult. For viewers studying ancient economic systems and the practical mechanisms that supported early state-level societies, growing administrative burdens contributed to weakening state control, setting the stage for political fragmentation and the rise of new regional powers. By the end of the 21st century BCE, UR's administrative model could no longer sustain territorial unity. After nearly a century of centralized governance under the UR3 dynasty, southern Mesopotamia faced mounting pressures that the state bureaucracy could not contain. By c. 2000 BCE, the combined effects of external incursions, internal secession, and demographic shifts began to unravel the intricate administrative and economic structures that had sustained UR's dominance. The efficiency of rationing systems, provincial oversight, and labor mobilization remained impressive in theory, but in practice, the state's reach increasingly exceeded its capacity to enforce compliance across a sprawling and diverse territory. One significant factor in UR's decline was external military pressure. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates repeated incursions by Elamite groups from the east, who attacked border towns and disrupted grain and livestock flows critical to the imperial economy. Elamite raids, combined with frontier instability, compromised the ability of provincial governors to maintain centralized control. Administrative records from cities such as Nippur and Umma show interruptions in tribute collection and irregular accounting entries during this period, suggesting that the state's logistical network was under strain. At the same time, Amorite migrations introduced new demographic and political dynamics in northern and central Mesopotamia. These semi-nomadic groups settled along the upper Euphrates and Tigris, gradually establishing local polities and challenging UR's authority. The arrival of Amorite clans altered local power balances, as previously loyal provincial centers either negotiated autonomy or shifted allegiance. Clay tablets from the late UR3 period record disputes over land and water allocation, indicating that integration of new populations placed additional burdens on the central bureaucracy. Internal governance also faced challenges. Several provincial centers appear to have seceded or operated with increasing autonomy, undermining the hierarchical structure established under Shulgi. Governors who once faithfully executed orders from the capital began asserting independence, reflecting both weakening royal authority and the practical difficulty of enforcing directives across distant regions. Fortifications in certain cities were strengthened, signaling local concerns about security in the absence of reliable central support. This fragmentation weakened the capacity of UR to mobilize labor, collect resources, and coordinate defense, leaving the state vulnerable to both internal dissent and external attack. The final blow to UR's territorial control came in c. 1940 BCE, when Elamite forces sacked the city. Excavations at UR indicate destruction layers consistent with military assault, including evidence of burned administrative complexes and abandoned palace structures. The fall of UR did not immediately extinguish Sumerian cultural traditions, but it marked the end of Sumerian political hegemony. Administrative continuity was disrupted, the centralized economy collapsed, and the intricate bureaucracy that had managed rationing, labor, and taxation ceased functioning at a systemic level. The decline of UR illustrates the limits of highly centralized bureaucratic states in a pre-modern context. While the UR3 administration successfully coordinated resources, labor, and governance for nearly a century, it remained vulnerable to environmental, military, and demographic shocks. The rigidity and scale that made it effective under strong leadership also made it susceptible to rapid collapse once those leaders were gone or challenged. Provincial autonomy, frontier incursions, and population pressures combined to fragment the political landscape, demonstrating that systemic decline is often the result of multiple interacting factors rather than a single cause. Despite this collapse, the UR3 period left enduring legacies. Standardized accounting, legal codification, and bureaucratic procedures influenced subsequent Mesopotamian states. Temple economies, provincial administration, and scribal practices were adopted and adapted by emerging polities in the Old Babylonian period, showing that institutional knowledge can survive the fall of a central authority. While UR itself ceased to dominate, the administrative and ideological frameworks it developed provided the foundation for the next phase of Mesopotamian state formation. For viewers examining systemic decline and the interplay between military, demographic, and bureaucratic pressures in early complex societies, new powers emerged in the Old Babylonian period, building upon and transforming the administrative and cultural foundations of UR3. The early 2nd millennium BCE saw the rise of new dynasties across Mesopotamia. In the wake of UR3's collapse, Mesopotamia experienced a period of political fragmentation and realignment. The vacuum left by the fall of centralized Sumerian authority allowed regional polities, particularly those led by Amorite dynasties, to assert control over key cities and territories. By c. 2000 BCE, the landscape was dominated by multiple small to medium-scale kingdoms, including Isin, Larsa, and the rising center of Babylon. Each of these states developed mechanisms of local governance, trade networks, and military infrastructure, often replicating and adapting the administrative practices inherited from the UR3 period. At Isin, rulers focused on religious legitimacy and temple patronage to consolidate authority. Administrative tablets indicate ongoing coordination with local temples, reflecting continuity in the integration of economic and spiritual institutions. Legal and accounting documents suggest that the city maintained control over land distribution, labor assignments, and grain collection, preserving elements of UR3 bureaucracy while operating independently. Larsa, meanwhile, leveraged its strategic position along the Euphrates to control irrigation networks and facilitate commerce, creating a competitive advantage in both agricultural production and long-distance trade. Babylon, initially a modest settlement, emerged as a key player through strategic political alliances and marriage networks with neighboring Amorite dynasties. Inscriptions and economic texts reveal shifting allegiances among city-states, often mediated through treaties, tribute arrangements, and intermarriage. These alliances were not permanent. Competition for territory and resources remained intense. Trade networks extended across southern Mesopotamia, reaching northern cities and the Zagros frontier, demonstrating that political fragmentation did not preclude economic integration. Amorite dynasties relied on both military organization and diplomatic negotiation to maintain influence. Fortifications, garrison centers, and administrative oversight were common features across these polities. Archaeological evidence, including wall structures and weapons caches, supports the textual record of ongoing conflicts and strategic positioning. At the same time, administrative tablets document routine taxation, rationing, and labor mobilization, illustrating that state functions were maintained even amidst competition. Culturally, these dynasties continued Sumerian traditions while introducing distinct Amorite influences, particularly in naming conventions, familial structures, and personal titles. Royal inscriptions frequently emphasized the ruler's piety and patronage of temples, linking political authority with religious legitimacy. This combination of inherited Sumerian bureaucratic practices and Amorite cultural identity created a hybridized model of governance, capable of sustaining urban centers while accommodating nomadic and semi-nomadic populations in surrounding territories. Despite fragmentation, a pattern of consolidation emerged over time. Certain cities, through strategic positioning and alliances, began accumulating resources and influence more effectively than others. Babylon's geographic advantage along trade routes and its political acumen allowed it to surpass neighboring centers, laying the groundwork for eventual regional dominance. Textual sources from contemporaneous rulers indicate recognition of Babylon as a rising authority, though the city had yet to achieve outright hegemony. Economically, the period maintained the administrative and resource management principles developed during UR3. Provincial officials recorded grain yields, livestock counts, and labor allocations, ensuring continuity of governance practices. Standardized measures and accounting systems persisted across city-states, allowing for comparability and coordination in trade and diplomacy. These mechanisms highlight the endurance of bureaucratic sophistication, even in a politically fragmented landscape. By c. 1800 BCE, the stage was set for a significant centralization of authority. Among competing city-states, one ruler, Hammurabi of Babylon, would leverage both inherited administrative techniques and strategic diplomacy to establish dominance. The preceding century of Amorite rule, regional competition, and institutional continuity provided the necessary infrastructure for his unification of southern Mesopotamia and the consolidation of the Old Babylonian state. For viewers studying geopolitical transitions, state continuity, and the interplay between regional competition and institutional inheritance, one ruler would soon achieve dominance, codifying law and centralizing authority across Mesopotamia. Hammurabi unified Babylonia through military force and administrative standardization. Upon ascending the throne of Babylon in c. 1792 BCE, Hammurabi inherited a relatively modest city-state within a fragmented Mesopotamia. His early reign focused on consolidating control over southern Babylonia, neutralizing rival Amorite dynasties, and asserting authority over strategically important cities such as Isin, Larsa, and Sippar. Textual records, including royal inscriptions, detail campaigns that combined military force, strategic alliances, and the absorption of defeated administrations into a centralized framework. This approach allowed Babylon to expand systematically, creating the foundation for one of the first territorial states in Mesopotamian history. Hammurabi's military success was paired with significant administrative reforms. He reorganized provincial governance by appointing loyal officials to oversee taxation, irrigation, and urban management. Economic texts from this period demonstrate a standardization of grain and livestock accounting, indicating that resource flows were closely monitored to ensure the functionality of both military campaigns and urban provisioning. By maintaining control over agricultural surpluses and labor contributions, Hammurabi could sustain extended campaigns while reinforcing the economic stability of his core territories. A defining feature of Hammurabi's reign was the codification of law, preserved on monumental stelae and widely disseminated across his kingdom. The Code of Hammurabi addressed criminal, civil, and commercial matters, establishing standardized punishments and procedures while embedding the king's authority within a legal framework. Tablets and inscriptions emphasized that justice was both a royal responsibility and a societal obligation. By publicly codifying laws, Hammurabi created a transparent and predictable system of governance, strengthening compliance and reducing arbitrariness in local adjudication. The code covered property disputes, contracts, debt obligations, family law, and labor regulations, reflecting the complexity of a state integrating multiple cities, social classes, and economic networks. Hammurabi also utilized legal codification to reinforce social hierarchy and central authority. Stele depict the king receiving divine sanction from Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice, linking political and religious legitimacy. This ideological component was instrumental in legitimizing the king's military campaigns and administrative interventions, particularly in newly acquired territories where loyalty may have been uncertain. Religious endorsement, combined with codified law, reinforced the central state's capacity to integrate diverse populations into a cohesive political system. Economic administration under Hammurabi benefited from innovations in record-keeping and provincial oversight. Cuneiform tablets document rations, labor allocations, and grain storage at urban and rural centers, echoing the administrative sophistication of the UR3 period. Officials maintained registers for taxation, land ownership, and commercial transactions, enabling the central government to monitor productivity and manage disputes effectively. This level of bureaucratic precision allowed the state to support military campaigns, enforce legal decrees, and maintain urban infrastructure simultaneously. Hammurabi's expansionist strategy was both strategic and sequential. Early campaigns targeted southern cities to secure vital irrigation networks and trade routes. Subsequent operations extended Babylonian influence northward toward Mari and Ashnuna, consolidating control over key corridors connecting Mesopotamia to the Levant and Zagros highlands. Inscriptions detail sieges, negotiated surrenders, and incorporation of defeated city administrations, reflecting a pragmatic combination of force and diplomacy. This careful approach allowed Babylon to expand rapidly without overextending resources or provoking simultaneous multi-front rebellions. The integration of conquered regions relied on a combination of administrative standardization and local collaboration. Governors were often retained under supervision, and local temple institutions continued to function as intermediaries between the populace and the central authority. By balancing continuity with central oversight, Hammurabi mitigated resistance while ensuring that taxation, labor, and law enforcement were consistent throughout his expanded territory. Archaeological evidence from Mari and other northern cities confirms the adoption of Babylonian economic and legal practices, demonstrating the reach of the administrative model. Hammurabi's codification of law and bureaucratic management had lasting effects on Mesopotamian governance. By aligning military, economic, and legal systems under centralized control, he created a model capable of sustaining urban populations, trade networks, and territorial authority. The visibility of the legal code, inscribed in durable stone and displayed publicly, reinforced both compliance and the ideological perception of a just ruler. It exemplified how codified law could complement military conquest and administrative oversight, ensuring that expansion translated into durable governance. By the conclusion of Hammurabi's reign in c. 1750 BCE, Babylon had transformed from a regional city-state into a dominant territorial power, exercising political, military, and economic control across central and southern Mesopotamia. His reforms institutionalized practices that allowed subsequent rulers to maintain authority, even as the state faced pressures from nomadic incursions and environmental fluctuations. The combination of legal codification, administrative centralization, and military consolidation set a precedent for future Mesopotamian empires and influenced governance models throughout the ancient Near East. For viewers analyzing legal history, administrative centralization, and the interplay between military power and governance in early states. After Hammurabi, the kingdom faced new pressures from external migrations and internal factionalism, initiating a gradual period of decentralization and transformation. By the mid-16th century BCE, the old Babylonian system could no longer maintain cohesion. Following Hammurabi's death in c. 1750 BCE, Babylonia entered a period of political instability. His successors faced internal challenges, including dynastic disputes, factionalism among provincial governors, and pressures from Amorite, Kassite, and other semi-nomadic groups in peripheral regions. Administrative continuity began to erode, as evidenced by incomplete or irregular cuneiform records documenting taxation, labor assignments, and temple obligations. The bureaucratic systems that had underpinned Hammurabi's territorial control remained conceptually intact, but their practical enforcement weakened under successive kings, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. External threats intensified in the following decades. Northern and western Mesopotamia saw the rise of Hittite influence, extending from Anatolia into territories long connected through trade and diplomacy with Babylonia. Diplomatic correspondence and fragmentary annals indicate that northern polities increasingly challenged Babylonian authority, while mercenary groups and border incursions disrupted irrigation-dependent agriculture and urban provisioning. Economic texts from the late Old Babylonian period show irregular grain deliveries and fluctuations in tribute, signaling the stress imposed by these disruptions on centralized administration. The culmination of this instability occurred with the Hittite sack of Babylon in c. 1595 BCE, led by King Mursalai I. Archaeological evidence, including destruction layers and burned administrative buildings, corroborates textual accounts of the city's conquest. The Hittite army's arrival was rapid and decisive, overwhelming Babylon's defensive capabilities and causing the collapse of institutional governance. Temple archives, royal palace records, and economic tablets ceased production, reflecting the disruption of both religious and state bureaucracies. This event marked the definitive end of the Old Babylonian political order, demonstrating the vulnerability of even well-administered territorial states to combined internal decay and external military pressure. The collapse of centralized authority illustrates several systemic challenges faced by early empires. The reliance on hierarchical provincial oversight and standardized economic procedures allowed for rapid expansion and integration but also created dependency on strong, consistent leadership. Once leadership weakened, coordination between urban centers, temple estates, and provincial governors faltered. Fragmentation of authority undermined both military preparedness and economic stability, amplifying the impact of external invasions. Despite the dramatic fall, cultural and institutional legacies persisted. Babylonian law, scribal practices, and religious structures continued to influence successive dynasties, including the Kassites, who later assumed control over Babylonia. The architectural and administrative foundations established during the Old Babylonian period provided a framework upon which new rulers could rebuild governance, illustrating the durability of institutional knowledge even after catastrophic collapse. By the conclusion of the Hittite invasion, Babylonia's territorial cohesion had dissolved, and control passed to a new dynasty, signaling the transition from Old Babylonian hegemony to Kassite dominance in the region. While political authority shifted, Mesopotamian cities, trade networks, and cultural institutions persisted, enabling continuity in economic, religious, and scholarly traditions. For viewers studying imperial vulnerability, the interaction of internal decay and external military pressure, and the consequences of administrative overextension in early states. Control of Babylonia passed to a new dynasty, initiating the Kassite period and a renewed phase of centralized governance in Mesopotamia. Kassite rule marked one of the longest continuous dynasties in Mesopotamian history. Following the disruption of the Old Babylonian period, Kassite rulers established control over Babylonia around c. 1595 BCE, creating a dynasty that would endure for more than 4 centuries. Their consolidation relied on a combination of military stabilization, administrative reorganization, and cultural integration. Unlike previous rulers, the Kassites adopted Babylonian language, religious institutions, and legal frameworks, blending their own traditions with existing Sumerian and Akkadian systems. This strategic assimilation facilitated local acceptance and minimized resistance, allowing the dynasty to maintain continuity in governance across the region. Kassite consolidation included restructuring provincial administration. Royal inscriptions and economic texts indicate the appointment of governors and officials to oversee urban centers, agricultural districts, and temple estates. These administrators collected tribute, monitored irrigation and harvests, and maintained the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain both urban populations and the military. Standardized cuneiform accounting, inherited from earlier periods, was preserved and expanded, demonstrating the Kassites' emphasis on efficient bureaucratic management. Military organization also contributed to stability. Kassite kings maintained garrisons at key locations and reinforced defensive works along the Euphrates and Tigris. Archaeological evidence suggests that fortifications were systematically repaired and expanded, providing security for trade routes and agricultural hinterlands. This emphasis on internal stability allowed the Kassite state to focus on long-term administrative planning rather than continuous conflict, distinguishing it from the more tumultuous Old Babylonian period. Culturally, the Kassites integrated into Babylonian religious and civic life. Kings patronized major temples in Babylon, Nippur, and other sacred cities, funding construction and ritual activities that legitimized their rule. The adoption of Babylonian deities and ceremonial practices reinforced ideological continuity, creating a shared cultural identity that transcended Kassite origins. Lexical lists, correspondence, and archival records suggest that scribes were trained in both Kassite and Babylonian traditions, ensuring administrative coherence across generations. Economic management under the Kassites preserved the institutional innovations of the UR3 and Old Babylonian periods. Provincial governors documented grain yields, livestock, and labor contributions, ensuring that resources were efficiently allocated to sustain urban populations and royal projects. Temple estates continued to function as centers of production, distribution, and ritual activity, integrating religious, economic, and political authority in a stable network that underpinned long-term governance. The Kassite dynasty's longevity allowed Babylonia to achieve unprecedented levels of internal cohesion. By maintaining continuity in administration, legal frameworks, and religious institutions, the state mitigated the disruptions that had previously destabilized the region. Textual evidence demonstrates consistent tribute collection, stable dynastic succession, and ongoing urban development, indicating that governance was both effective and enduring. By c. 1400 BCE, Babylonia under Kassite rule had established a period of relative stability, positioning the kingdom as a major actor in the broader political and economic networks of the Near East. Provinces were consolidated, trade routes were secure, and cultural institutions functioned reliably, creating the foundation for active participation in international diplomacy. For viewers examining long-term governance and how cultural integration, administrative continuity, and bureaucratic efficiency contribute to political stability. With domestic consolidation achieved, Babylonia entered a period of active participation in international diplomacy and interregional networks. Babylonia became a key participant in a wider Near Eastern diplomatic system. By c. 1400 BCE, the Kassite dynasty had established Babylonia as a politically stable and economically integrated kingdom, enabling it to engage actively in interregional trade and diplomacy. The kingdom participated in networks extending across Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, exchanging raw materials, luxury goods, and administrative knowledge with contemporary powers. These interactions are documented extensively in the Amarna letters, a corpus of diplomatic correspondence primarily between Babylonian kings and rulers of Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, and Assyria. The letters reveal not only political negotiations but also detailed agreements on trade, marriage alliances, and mutual defense. Babylonian trade during this period focused on both strategic commodities and luxury items. Tin, essential for bronze production, was imported via Anatolia and northern trade routes. Horses, valued for chariotry and military mobility, arrived from the Zagros highlands and surrounding steppe regions. In return, Babylonia exported agricultural produce, textiles, and crafted goods, facilitating wealth accumulation and the consolidation of royal authority. Archaeological evidence, including imported cylinder seals and high-quality pottery, indicates that these goods circulated widely, reflecting the kingdom's participation in a complex, interconnected economy. Diplomatic correspondence emphasized marriage alliances, gift exchange, and political protocol. Letters often documented the exchange of gold, silver, and other precious materials, reinforcing bonds between rulers while formalizing obligations. Treaties recorded in these letters stipulated territorial boundaries, military assistance, and mutual recognition of sovereignty. The precision and formality of these interactions illustrate that Babylonia was not a peripheral actor but a recognized and respected partner within the broader Near Eastern political landscape. Administrative practices facilitated this international engagement. Babylonian scribes maintained diplomatic archives and detailed records of trade transactions, ensuring that agreements were monitored and obligations were met. Economic data, such as tribute or cargo lists, were carefully documented, reflecting the same bureaucratic rigor used in domestic governance. This continuity between internal administration and international affairs enhanced the state's capacity to negotiate effectively and project authority abroad. The integration of Babylonia into regional networks also had cultural and technological implications. Exchange with Hutti, Assyria, and Egypt facilitated the spread of military innovations, artistic motifs, and religious ideas. Cylinder seals, palace reliefs, and temple inscriptions from the period demonstrate a fusion of local and foreign influences, highlighting the role of diplomatic and commercial contacts in shaping Kassite culture. These interactions helped maintain Babylonia's prominence, even as domestic resources and provincial coordination continued to support the central administration. Despite these successes, the Kassite system faced gradual destabilization due to external pressures. Military threats from Assyrian expansion, incursions by Aramean tribes, and competition over trade routes began to strain royal resources. Diplomatic correspondence increasingly reflects appeals for support or recognition of authority, suggesting that international relations were becoming more complex and contested. Economic reliance on imported goods, particularly tin and horses, made the kingdom vulnerable to disruption along distant trade networks, exposing strategic weaknesses that would grow over the following centuries. By c. 1200 BCE, Babylonia had demonstrated both the advantages and limits of long-distance trade and diplomacy. The Kassite dynasty had secured wealth, political prestige, and cultural influence through sustained participation in interregional systems. However, emerging military pressures, shifting trade dynamics, and the increasing autonomy of provincial centers foreshadowed the eventual decline of centralized Kassite power. For viewers studying international relations, interregional trade, and the role of diplomacy in sustaining long-term state power in the ancient Near East, external pressures, including incursions and trade disruptions, gradually destabilized Kassite authority, setting the stage for the dynasty's eventual decline. By the early 12th century BCE, Babylon faced renewed military threats. By c. 1200 BCE, the Kassite dynasty, after nearly 4 centuries of rule, confronted mounting internal and external pressures that would ultimately end their reign. Internally, provincial governors and local elites began exercising greater autonomy, weakening centralized authority. Administrative records from late Kassite periods show irregular tribute collection and gaps in labor mobilization, suggesting that bureaucratic oversight was becoming inconsistent. This fragmentation undermined the dynasty's ability to respond effectively to military threats and economic challenges. Externally, Babylonia faced repeated Elamite incursions from the east. Inscriptions and annals report campaigns led by Elamite kings targeting southern and central cities, often exploiting local discontent. Archaeological layers in Babylonian urban centers indicate burning, destruction of administrative buildings, and disruptions in temple complexes, confirming that these invasions inflicted both material and institutional damage. The Elamites' strategic aim appears to have been control over agricultural heartlands and trade routes critical to Babylonian stability. The combination of military pressure and internal disunity accelerated the collapse of Kassite authority. Royal inscriptions from the late dynasty depict defensive measures and temporary alliances, but these were insufficient to counter repeated incursions. Urban centers increasingly operated independently, prioritizing local defense and survival over centralized coordination. Economic and administrative continuity suffered, as the loss of control over resource allocation and taxation diminished the capacity of the state to sustain both the military and civic infrastructure. By c. 1155 BCE, the Elamites successfully penetrated Babylonian territory, marking the definitive end of Kassite rule. The dynasty's collapse was not a sudden event, but the culmination of decades of structural vulnerability, including bureaucratic fragmentation, elite autonomy, and sustained external military pressure. Despite the fall of centralized authority, cultural, religious, and economic practices established under the Kassites persisted, allowing for continuity in administrative methods and temple institutions under subsequent regimes. For viewers tracking regional power shifts, the interaction between military pressure and internal fragmentation, and the factors leading to dynastic collapse in Mesopotamia. A rising power in the north, Assyria, would soon dominate Mesopotamia, establishing a new phase of regional hegemony. Assyria emerged as a dominant power through organized military expansion. By c. 1400 BCE, Assyria, centered on the city of Assur, began consolidating its authority over northern Mesopotamia and neighboring regions. Under kings such as Ubaid I, the state transitioned from a city-state dependent on trade and local agriculture into a territorial power with expansionist ambitions. Royal inscriptions and administrative texts indicate systematic campaigns against Hurrian and Mitanni territories, establishing Assyria as a regional military actor capable of projecting force beyond its traditional borders. The rise of Assyria was closely linked to military organization and logistical innovation. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates the development of standing armies, including specialized infantry and chariot units, supported by detailed provisioning systems. Administrative tablets document rationing of grain, allocation of horses, and maintenance of weapons, reflecting a centralized infrastructure designed to sustain sustained military operations. These practices allowed Assyria to conduct prolonged campaigns while maintaining control over its heartland. Assyrian kings imposed vassalage and tribute systems on conquered territories, formalizing political domination without necessitating permanent occupation in all regions. Vassal rulers retained local authority in exchange for regular tribute, military support, and recognition of Assyrian overlordship. Inscriptions from the period frequently describe the collection of silver, timber, and other resources, indicating that economic integration accompanied military expansion. This combination of force and administration strengthened Assyria's strategic position and allowed incremental growth into a cohesive territorial state. The consolidation of Assyria also relied on diplomatic engagement. Treaties with neighboring states, often recorded on clay tablets, codified obligations such as military support and non-aggression. These agreements reinforced Assyria's influence without direct conquest, supplementing its military campaigns and enabling flexible governance over a diverse region. The dual strategy of diplomacy and coercion contributed to stability in newly integrated territories. Culturally, the Middle Assyrian state adapted and incorporated regional traditions, particularly in religious and administrative practice. Kings presented themselves as divinely sanctioned rulers of Assur and patronized temple construction projects, linking political authority with religious legitimacy. Textual evidence shows continuity in cuneiform administration, including standardized measurement systems, accounting methods, and record-keeping practices, enabling effective oversight across expanding territories. Assyria's territorial growth during this period laid the groundwork for future imperial ambitions. Control of northern trade routes, access to timber and metals, and experience in managing vassal states created the institutional and logistical foundation necessary for later expansion into Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. The integration of military, administrative, and diplomatic strategies demonstrated how a relatively small city-state could evolve into a proto-imperial power through systematic planning and sustained application of force. By c. 1050 BCE, the Middle Assyrian state had established a durable territorial framework, secured borders, and developed mechanisms for long-term military and administrative control. This period of expansion and consolidation illustrates how organized militarization, strategic vassalage, and bureaucratic oversight combined to transform Assyria into a dominant regional actor, setting the stage for its emergence as a full-fledged empire. For viewers analyzing military state development, the relationship between organized armies, territorial administration, and vassalage in early empires. Assyria would later transform this territorial dominance into a centralized empire, extending authority across Mesopotamia and beyond. Neo-Assyrian rulers transformed expansion into systematic imperial policy. By c. 911 BCE, Assyria re-emerged under Adad-nirari II, initiating the Neo-Assyrian period characterized by large-scale territorial expansion and highly organized administration. Subsequent rulers, including Ashurnasirpal II, are 883 to 859 BCE, and Tiglath-Pileser III, are 745 to 727 BCE, institutionalized the practices that allowed Assyria to control vast and diverse regions. Their approach combined military conquest, administrative centralization, and population management, transforming previously autonomous territories into components of a coherent imperial system. Ashurnasirpal II's reign illustrates the early development of provincial administration. Conquered territories were divided into provinces governed by royal appointees responsible for taxation, conscription, and law enforcement. These officials reported directly to the central authority in Assur and later Nimrud, ensuring loyalty and reducing the potential for rebellion. Archaeological and textual evidence, including palace archives and provincial letters, demonstrates that record-keeping was standardized across provinces, encompassing resources, labor, and military obligations. Tiglath-Pileser III expanded and refined these mechanisms, introducing mass deportations as a tool of imperial control. Populations from rebellious or strategically important regions were relocated, reducing the likelihood of insurrection while redistributing labor to areas of economic or military significance. Inscriptions detail deportations from Syria, Babylonia, and the Levant, providing evidence of the logistical capabilities of the Assyrian administration. This policy simultaneously reinforced central authority, augmented the workforce for state projects, and integrated diverse populations into the imperial economy. The Neo-Assyrian Empire also relied on bureaucratic centralization. Provincial governors, military commanders, and temple officials were incorporated into a hierarchical administrative network, with clearly defined responsibilities and reporting structures. Administrative correspondence, legal texts, and economic records indicate rigorous monitoring of tribute, agricultural production, and construction projects. Standardized weights, measures, and accounting procedures facilitated consistency across regions, allowing the central government to enforce policy and mobilize resources efficiently. Military organization underpinned administrative control. The empire maintained standing armies capable of rapid deployment, supported by logistics systems that coordinated supplies, garrisons, and transportation. Provinces contributed soldiers and resources according to centrally determined quotas, ensuring that military campaigns could be sustained over extended distances. The integration of civil and military administration exemplified the Neo-Assyrian model, where governance and conquest were mutually reinforcing. Diplomatic engagement complemented direct administration. Client kings and vassal states were monitored through tribute obligations and periodic inspections, while strategic marriages and treaties ensured loyalty without requiring permanent occupation. Correspondence and treaty texts reveal that Assyrian rulers applied a combination of coercion, incentive, and negotiation to maintain control over subordinate polities. These practices extended the reach of imperial authority beyond the physical presence of the Assyrian army, enabling governance over a wide geographic area with a relatively limited administrative apparatus. The Neo-Assyrian approach also reinforced ideological legitimacy. Royal inscriptions and monumental reliefs depict kings as divinely sanctioned agents of Assur, charged with enforcing justice and order across the empire. This ideology justified military campaigns, deportations, and administrative oversight, integrating political, religious, and legal authority into a coherent imperial framework. Textual and archaeological evidence shows that temples and religious officials were incorporated into the bureaucratic network, linking spiritual authority with state administration. By c. 745 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian administrative system had achieved a level of complexity unprecedented in the ancient Near East. The combination of provincial governance, population management, standardized bureaucracy, and ideological legitimation allowed Assyria to control vast territories efficiently. These structures enabled the empire to sustain continuous military campaigns, extract tribute, and maintain cohesion across diverse populations. For viewers studying large-scale governance, imperial integration, and the methods by which military expansion was institutionalized into enduring administrative practice. These administrative systems supported unprecedented military reach, laying the foundation for the empire's peak under successive Neo-Assyrian rulers. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria controlled territory from Egypt to Iran. The Neo-Assyrian Empire reached its zenith under kings such as Sargon II, r. 722 to 705 BCE, Sennacherib, r. 705 to 681 BCE, and Ashurbanipal, r. 668 to 627 BCE. These rulers consolidated and expanded Assyrian control over the Near East, incorporating Egypt, the Levant, Babylonia, and parts of the Iranian plateau into a single, administratively cohesive empire. Royal inscriptions, annals, and monumental reliefs document campaigns, sieges, and the construction of fortified provincial capitals, illustrating both the military and bureaucratic sophistication that underpinned imperial dominance. Sargon II's reign marked a period of territorial consolidation and expansion. He established new administrative centers, integrated vassal states, and subdued rebellious regions, particularly in the Levant and northern Mesopotamia. Textual evidence from royal archives details the use of standing armies, provincial governors, and tribute systems to maintain control over distant territories. These strategies allowed the Assyrian state to project authority effectively while mitigating the risks of local insurgencies. Sennacherib's administration focused on both military campaigns and infrastructural development. His campaigns against Babylon, Judah, and Elam are recorded in both cuneiform inscriptions and annals, emphasizing the integration of military action with political objectives. Sennacherib also invested in irrigation projects, palace construction, and urban planning, demonstrating that imperial stability required both coercive and administrative measures. These activities reinforced central authority and ensured the logistical support necessary for sustained military operations. Ashurbanipal presided over the empire at its territorial apogee, establishing the largest extent of Mesopotamian control in history. His reign is noted for military victories, administrative centralization, and the creation of the Library of Ashurbanipal, which preserved cuneiform texts on law, religion, and science. The library illustrates the dual focus of Assyrian governance, projecting military power while maintaining a robust cultural and bureaucratic infrastructure. Provincial archives and correspondence document the continued functioning of taxation, resource allocation, and population management across vast distances. Despite these achievements, the empire faced systemic vulnerabilities. Continuous military campaigns strained resources, while provincial governors and vassal states occasionally rebelled, exploiting distances and communication delays. Economic stress from prolonged warfare, overextension, and reliance on tribute created fiscal pressures. Archaeological evidence from peripheral regions indicates urban decline and interruptions in administrative continuity prior to the empire's final collapse. External pressures compounded internal weaknesses. Coalitions of Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and Elamites coordinated campaigns against Assyria in the late 7th century BCE. Texts from Babylon and Nineveh describe sieges, destruction of fortifications, and the capture of provincial centers. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE and Assur in 609 BCE marked the definitive end of Assyrian dominance. Administrative tablets ceased, monumental inscriptions were destroyed or abandoned, and centralized authority disintegrated rapidly, reflecting the fragility of imperial systems under combined internal and external stress. The collapse of Assyria demonstrates several structural dynamics of empire. While military organization, bureaucracy, and ideology enabled rapid expansion and long-term control, overextension, resource dependency, and decentralized provincial pressures left the state vulnerable. Internal dissent, coupled with coordinated external attacks, created conditions in which even the most sophisticated administration could not prevent disintegration. Despite the fall of Assyria, its cultural, administrative, and military innovations persisted, influencing successor states such as Babylonia and the emerging Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Assyrian model of provincial governance, deportation, and military logistics provided a framework for subsequent Near Eastern rulers, illustrating the lasting impact of imperial strategies even after territorial collapse. For viewers tracking the rise and fall of empires, the interaction of military power, administrative control, and structural vulnerability, and the lessons of overextension in early states. With the collapse of Assyrian authority, Babylon re-emerged as a regional center under new leadership, marking the start of the Neo-Babylonian period. Babylon regained political autonomy after centuries of foreign dominance. By 626 BCE, the political vacuum created by the decline of the Neo-Assyrian Empire allowed Nabopolassar to assert control over Babylon and surrounding territories. Textual sources, including Babylonian chronicles and royal inscriptions, document his consolidation of power in southern Mesopotamia, marking the first successful native reassertion of authority in the region since the Kassite collapse over 4 centuries earlier. Nabopolassar capitalized on Assyria's weakened state, leveraging both military and diplomatic strategies to secure Babylonian independence. A central component of Nabopolassar's strategy was his alliance with the Medes, coordinated to jointly defeat the remnants of Assyrian control. Military campaigns between 616 and 609 BCE targeted key Assyrian cities, including Nineveh, Haran, and Ashur, resulting in the systematic dismantling of Assyrian authority. Archaeological evidence from these sites indicates destruction layers corresponding to this period, supporting textual accounts of coordinated military efforts. The alliance not only neutralized Assyria but also established Babylon as the preeminent power in Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's reign focused on re-establishing centralized governance. Administrative documents indicate the reappointment of provincial governors, restoration of tax collection systems, and reorganization of temple estates. By maintaining continuity with older Babylonian bureaucratic traditions while incorporating innovations developed under Assyrian administration, Nabopolassar ensured both efficiency and legitimacy. Temple records and legal texts suggest that religious authority was closely integrated with political power, reinforcing his sovereignty in both civic and ceremonial spheres. Economic and infrastructural projects were equally important. Nabopolassar invested in the repair of canals, roads, and city fortifications, facilitating trade, agricultural production, and defense. These initiatives stabilized the urban and rural economy, providing a foundation for population growth and sustained revenue generation. Archaeological evidence from Babylon shows large-scale reconstruction of walls and gates, signaling the revival of urban centrality and regional control. Nabopolassar's restoration of Babylonian autonomy also had symbolic and ideological significance. Royal inscriptions portray him as a liberator and divinely sanctioned ruler, legitimizing native leadership after centuries of foreign domination. Religious and administrative continuity reinforced his claims, ensuring that Babylonian cultural and civic identity was actively maintained during the transition from Assyrian oversight. By 605 BCE, following the final defeat of Assyrian and allied forces at the Battle of Carchemish, Nabopolassar had secured both military and political control over Babylonia. His reign laid the institutional and territorial groundwork for the Neo-Babylonian Empire, establishing a model of centralized authority, integrated administration, and coordinated military power that would be expanded by his successors. For viewers studying state restoration, the strategic integration of military, administrative, and ideological measures in reclaiming political autonomy. With independence secured, successors like Nebuchadnezzar II would expand building projects, administrative structures, and imperial influence, marking the apex of Babylonian power. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon became the preeminent power of the Near East. Following the consolidation of Babylonian independence under Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar II, r. 605 to 562 BCE, ascended to the throne and initiated a period of political, military, and infrastructural reconstruction that would define the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Cuneiform inscriptions, royal chronicles, and architectural evidence document both the consolidation of administrative authority and the expansion of territorial control across the Levant and Mesopotamia. Nebuchadnezzar's reign is particularly noted for extensive urban and architectural projects within Babylon. Monumental construction included the repair and expansion of city walls, gates such as the Ishtar Gate, and the reconstruction of temples dedicated to Marduk and other deities. Archaeological layers corroborate large-scale masonry, brickwork, and ceremonial platforms, demonstrating both the king's investment in civic infrastructure and his use of monumental architecture to reinforce ideological authority. These projects enhanced urban centrality and facilitated economic and administrative integration across the empire. Administratively, Nebuchadnezzar II continued and refined systems established under his father. Provincial governance was structured through appointed officials who managed tribute, taxation, and local security, ensuring the efficient extraction of resources from both urban and rural regions. Temple estates remained integral to state administration, serving as centers of economic production, labor mobilization, and social regulation. Archival evidence shows meticulous record-keeping of grain, livestock, and labor contributions, highlighting the bureaucratic sophistication of his reign. Militarily, Nebuchadnezzar extended Babylonian influence through campaigns in the Levant, targeting Judah, Phoenicia, and other Levantine polities. The Babylonian chronicles record sieges, tribute demands, and the subjugation of local rulers. These campaigns secured trade routes, reinforced the empire's borders, and ensured access to strategic resources such as timber, metals, and agricultural surpluses. Military expeditions were supported by the logistical infrastructure of the state, including stored provisions, garrisons, and mobilized labor forces, reflecting the integration of administrative and martial functions. Cultural and ideological policies reinforced imperial legitimacy. Nebuchadnezzar II emphasized the divine sanction of kingship through temple restoration, ritual observance, and monumental inscriptions, presenting himself as both a protector of Marduk's cult and a guarantor of political stability. Religious integration served to consolidate support across newly subjugated territories and reinforce social cohesion within the capital. Textual and epigraphic evidence shows coordinated ceremonial activity alongside ongoing urban development, demonstrating the interplay between ideology and governance. Economic and logistical management under Nebuchadnezzar II facilitated long-term imperial stability. Irrigation systems, transport networks, and urban markets were maintained and expanded, supporting both agricultural production and interregional trade. Administrative archives indicate regularized tribute collection and redistribution, ensuring sufficient resources for military campaigns, urban maintenance, and elite patronage. The integration of economic, administrative, and military systems under a centralized authority exemplifies the model of imperial governance achieved during this period. By the end of his reign in 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II had secured Babylon as the dominant political, military, and cultural center of the Near East. His combined focus on urban infrastructure, provincial administration, military conquest, and religious legitimation established the apex of Neo-Babylonian authority and set a precedent for subsequent rulers. For viewers focused on urban and imperial development, demonstrating how strategic construction, administrative integration, and military campaigns reinforced both territorial control and ideological authority. Despite these achievements, internal political shifts, succession disputes, and external pressures gradually weakened the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, paving the way for Persian conquest. By 539 BCE, Mesopotamia became part of the Achaemenid Empire. Following the death of Nebuchadnezzar II in 562 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire entered a period of internal instability and weakening central authority. Successive kings, including Marduk and Nabonidus, faced disputes over succession, administrative inefficiency, and challenges to legitimacy. Royal inscriptions and Babylonian chronicles indicate uneven control over provincial governors, irregular tribute collection, and occasional unrest within key cities. This internal fragmentation eroded the cohesion necessary to maintain an expansive empire. During this period, external pressures became increasingly consequential. The rising power of the Persian kingdom under Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, presented a direct challenge to Babylonian dominance. Persian expansion into the Iranian plateau and interactions with local vassals strategically positioned Cyrus to intervene in Mesopotamian affairs. Diplomatic records and later historical sources, including Babylonian chronicles, show that Cyrus cultivated alliances with disaffected groups within the empire, including priestly elites and provincial officials, to undermine central control from within. In 539 BCE, Cyrus II launched a carefully coordinated campaign against Babylon. Contemporary accounts, including the Cyrus Cylinder, describe the relatively bloodless surrender of the city, emphasizing both strategic planning and the exploitation of internal divisions. Archaeological evidence corroborates continuity in urban infrastructure with limited signs of widespread destruction, suggesting that the Persians sought to incorporate Babylon into their empire rather than to annihilate it. Cyrus' conquest marked the definitive end of native Mesopotamian rule, terminating centuries of indigenous dynastic governance. The Persian administration incorporated Babylon into the Achaemenid imperial system, retaining many existing institutions while installing satraps loyal to the central authority in Persepolis. Temples and civic offices continued to function, but ultimate political and military power now resided with the Persian monarchy. Textual evidence indicates that Babylonian law, economic systems, and religious structures were largely preserved under Persian oversight, demonstrating both the continuity of local practices and the transformation of sovereignty. The fall of Babylon illustrates the interaction of internal weakness and external pressure in imperial collapse. Dynastic disputes, bureaucratic fragmentation, and contested legitimacy made the empire susceptible to conquest by a strategically capable external power. The Persian incorporation of Mesopotamia also exemplifies how imperial transitions in the ancient Near East often involved both coercion and pragmatic accommodation of existing institutions. By 539 BCE, Mesopotamia had ceased to exist as an independent political entity, becoming a crucial province within the vast Achaemenid Empire. Despite the loss of native rule, Babylonian administrative systems, legal traditions, and cultural achievements continued to influence governance and society under Persian authority, ensuring the region's enduring significance in Near Eastern history. For viewers examining geopolitical change, the dynamics of imperial decline, and the processes by which emerging powers absorb established states, Mesopotamia's legacy, from Sumerian city-states to Babylonian empire, extended far beyond political collapse, influencing subsequent civilizations across the ancient Near East and beyond. Mesopotamian legal principles persisted in subsequent imperial systems. Mesopotamia's extensive history of city-states and empires produced foundational legal and administrative frameworks that influenced the broader ancient Near East. From the earliest Sumerian codifications to the Code of Hammurabi, Mesopotamian societies developed systematic approaches to governance, property rights, and social regulation. Archaeological evidence, including clay tablets and monumental stelae, demonstrates a consistent emphasis on codifying rules to manage increasingly complex urban populations and economic systems. These legal structures provided clarity in civil, commercial, and criminal matters, serving as models for later states in Babylonia, Assyria, and beyond. The administrative sophistication of Mesopotamia is evident in the vast archives recovered from sites such as Ur, Nippur, and Nineveh. Record-keeping practices included standardized measures, accounting for grain, livestock, labor, and tribute. Cuneiform tablets document the allocation of rations, mobilization of labor, and tax collection, revealing a bureaucracy capable of coordinating resources across multiple cities and provinces. These systems were not static. Successive empires refined and expanded them, creating continuity in governance that persisted under the Neo-Babylonian and Persian administrations. Mesopotamian law also established precedents for proportional justice and institutional authority. Hammurabi's code, for example, articulated penalties scaled to social status, reflecting societal hierarchies while codifying enforcement procedures. Other city-state and imperial texts detail contracts, debt management, and property rights, illustrating a consistent concern for predictable administration. These legal innovations were adapted by subsequent Near Eastern powers, informing both civil governance and imperial oversight, and serving as a template for the integration of law into bureaucratic infrastructure. Institutional continuity extended to the organization of provincial governance and central authority. Evidence from Assyrian and Babylonian archives shows that offices, territorial divisions, and reporting hierarchies maintained principles established in earlier periods. Governors, temple administrators, and scribes operated within codified roles, ensuring both efficiency and accountability. Administrative procedures, such as standardized documentation, verification of accounts, and formal reporting, were maintained across centuries, underscoring the enduring influence of early Mesopotamian governance models. Interpretive analyses highlight that these frameworks were not merely reactive but functioned as proactive tools for state cohesion. Legal codes stabilized social relations, administrative systems enabled resource distribution, and governance structures facilitated expansion and integration. By providing consistent methods of managing populations, trade, and military obligations, Mesopotamian innovations created a durable institutional template that shaped subsequent empires, including the Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Achaemenid states. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the principles established in Mesopotamian law and administration had been diffused across the Near East, influencing civic practice, imperial administration, and legal thought for centuries. These enduring legacies illustrate the capacity of early Mesopotamian societies to generate systemic innovations that transcended the lifespan of individual rulers or dynasties. For viewers studying institutional continuity, demonstrating how legal and administrative systems established in Mesopotamia informed later governance models across successive empires. Alongside legal and bureaucratic innovations, the development of writing provided another enduring legacy that shaped communication, record-keeping, and scholarship across the ancient world. Cuneiform remained in use for more than 3 millennia. The invention of cuneiform writing in the late 4th millennium BCE represented one of Mesopotamia's most enduring intellectual contributions. Initially developed for administrative and economic purposes, cuneiform evolved into a complex system capable of recording language, law, literature, and scientific observation. Archaeological finds, including clay tablets from Uruk, Nippur, and Nineveh, reveal the gradual transformation from pictographic tokens to a sophisticated syllabic script that facilitated long-term record-keeping and knowledge transmission. Scribal culture became a cornerstone of Mesopotamian administration. Schools attached to temples and palaces trained scribes in reading, writing, and arithmetic, ensuring a steady supply of trained personnel for bureaucratic, economic, and religious functions. Texts from these schools, including lexical lists, exercises, and correspondence manuals, provide evidence of structured education and codified methods for preserving institutional knowledge. This standardization underpinned both the functioning of the state and the continuity of cultural memory across centuries. Beyond administration, cuneiform enabled intellectual and scientific achievements. Astronomical observations, mathematical tables, medical texts, and divinatory literature were systematically recorded, forming a corpus that influenced subsequent Babylonian, Assyrian, and Persian scholarship. Lexical lists and bilingual dictionaries, often compiled on clay tablets, facilitated the study and transmission of Sumerian and Akkadian languages across generations. Such texts demonstrate an early commitment to knowledge management, ensuring that complex information could be preserved, taught, and applied across different regions and periods. Cuneiform's longevity is striking. Despite shifts in political power, from Sumerian city-states to Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires, the script remains central to administration, diplomacy, and scholarly activity. Tablets from the 1st millennium BCE, including correspondence between Assyrian officials and regional governors, reflect continuity in documentation methods. Even as spoken languages evolved, cuneiform functioned as a literary and legal lingua franca, facilitating governance and cultural cohesion over a vast geographic area. The intellectual traditions fostered by Mesopotamian scribal culture had broader regional implications. Administrative techniques, astronomical knowledge, and educational practices influenced neighboring civilizations, including the Hittites, Elamites, and later Persians. The emphasis on structured record-keeping and systematic scholarship provided a model for knowledge preservation and bureaucratic efficiency, reinforcing the connection between literacy, governance, and state stability. Interpretively, cuneiform demonstrates the integration of technology and governance. Writing was not an isolated innovation. It was intimately linked to economic administration, legal codification, and imperial management. The evolution of the script reflects adaptive responses to the challenges of managing increasingly complex societies, enabling states to maintain continuity, transmit expertise, and codify intellectual traditions over centuries. By the end of the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamian cuneiform had influenced both practical administration and intellectual inquiry throughout the ancient Near East. Its durability underscores the capacity of early societies to create technologies and knowledge systems with profound and lasting impacts, shaping law, scholarship, and bureaucracy long after political control shifted. For viewers analyzing knowledge systems, demonstrating how writing, record-keeping, and scribal education sustained administrative, legal, and scholarly continuity across millennia. Alongside legal frameworks and intellectual traditions, Mesopotamian urbanism provided a lasting model for city planning, monumental architecture, and civic organization in the ancient world. Mesopotamian urban frameworks shaped later models of state organization. Mesopotamian cities, from Uruk and Ur to Babylon and Nippur, established urban models that combined administrative, religious, and commercial functions within structured spatial layouts. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that city planning emphasized central temples, palace complexes, and systematically arranged residential districts. Streets, canals, and fortifications were carefully integrated, facilitating both trade and defense. This combination of infrastructure and civic organization created a blueprint for subsequent urban centers across the Near East. Monumental architecture was a key feature of Mesopotamian urbanism. Ziggurats, city walls, and palace complexes not only served functional roles, but also embodied political authority and ideological legitimacy. Inscriptions and foundation deposits reveal deliberate design choices that reinforced the centrality of rulers and religious institutions. These monumental structures set precedents for spatial hierarchy, civic identity, and symbolic representation in urban environments, influencing the design of cities in Assyria, Babylonia, and later Hellenistic and Persian settlements. Cultural memory was preserved through both physical and textual means. The replication of urban templates, maintenance of canals, and continued use of civic and religious centers ensured continuity across centuries. Administrative records, legal codes, and literary compositions reinforced shared knowledge of governance, ritual, and social norms. These combined elements allowed Mesopotamian urbanism to serve as a model of state organization, providing subsequent civilizations with practical and ideological guidance for city construction and management. Interpretively, Mesopotamian urbanism illustrates the integration of infrastructure, governance, and cultural continuity. Cities were not merely population centers. They functioned as nodes of political authority, economic coordination, and religious observance. The careful planning of space, standardization of civic features, and monumental emphasis on central institutions created a durable urban template that shaped the evolution of cities across the ancient Near East. The influence of Mesopotamian urban frameworks extended beyond physical construction. Administrative systems embedded in city layouts facilitated efficient governance, while civic and religious symbolism reinforced societal cohesion. Successive empires, Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian, adopted and adapted these models, demonstrating the long-term impact of Mesopotamian spatial and organizational strategies. By the close of the first millennium BCE, the legacy of Mesopotamian urbanism was firmly embedded in regional cultural memory. Its principles informed city planning, architectural hierarchy, and civic administration across the Near East, leaving a tangible and intellectual imprint on subsequent civilizations. For viewers studying civilizational impact, illustrating how urban design, monumental construction, and cultural continuity provided lasting frameworks for political and social organization. This concludes the chronological arc of Mesopotamian history, demonstrating how the region's innovations in law, writing, urbanism, and governance created enduring legacies that shaped the ancient Near East and beyond. If you found this deep dive into Mesopotamian history insightful, subscribe for more evidence-based documentaries exploring the civilizations that shaped our world. Hit the notification bell to follow our chronological journey through empires, urban innovations, and lasting legacies. Leave a comment sharing which era or innovation fascinated you most, and join our community of history enthusiasts who value clarity, scholarship, and immersive storytelling. For the full experience, consider watching with headphones and consulting the timestamps for specific periods, from the first settlements to the Neo-Babylonian legacy. Dive deeper, stay curious, and let history guide your understanding of civilization.